Theras was carrying his father's red wool cloak across the courtyard when the morning wind came down from Taygetus and lifted its heavy edge like a sail. He caught it before it brushed the packed earth, pressed the cloth against his chest, and looked toward the doorway where his mother was waiting. Somewhere beyond the tiled roofs, a bronze trumpet sounded from the direction of the training ground, and dogs began answering one another along the lanes of Sparta. This was the last morning Theras would wake as a small boy entirely belonging to his household. Before sunset, he would be placed among other boys of his age, and the long education expected of a Spartan citizen would begin. Midnight Cat follows quietly beside him now, through a city without walls, and into a world where nearly every ordinary habit carried the weight of duty. Theras did not yet understand that weight. At 7 years old, he understood the roughness of wool, the sweetness of dried figs, the cold of water drawn before sunrise, and the particular sound his father made when sharpening a bronze-edged knife on stone. He knew which hens could be approached without being pecked. He knew that his little sister, Timareta, would steal olives from his bowl whenever their mother looked away. He knew that the peaks west of Sparta turned pale before the sun reached the valley. These seemed important matters. His father, Ageson, was waiting near the outer door. He was not dressed for battle. The cloak Theras carried was the finest thing about him that morning. Beneath it, Ageson wore a simple tunic, belted at the waist. His hair, as was customary among adult Spartan men, had been allowed to grow long. It was combed back carefully, and Theras had often watched his mother oil it before religious festivals or military musters. Ageson took the cloak without ceremony. You held it off the ground. Theras nodded. His father settled it across his shoulders. That is enough. Praise in their household usually came in such small portions. Theras's mother, Lysandra, stood behind them with one hand resting against the wooden doorpost. She was taller than many women Theras had seen among visitors to Sparta, and she moved with the easy strength of someone accustomed to managing land, household stores, servants, animals, and accounts during the long periods when her husband ate, trained, or traveled with other men of his citizen group. She had already inspected Theras's tunic twice. The cloth was plain and newly washed. She tugged once at its shoulder fastening, and then bent to straighten the boy's belt. "You will grow," she said. Theras waited, expecting more. "That will cause trouble for the tunic." Timareta laughed from the courtyard. Theras glared at her. She was 5, and had spent the morning behaving as though her brother were being taken away mainly for her entertainment. "Will they cut his hair?" she asked. "Not today," Lysandra said. "Will they make him sleep outside?" "Not today." "Will they give me his bed?" Theras turned. "No." Timareta considered this carefully and looked disappointed. Lysandra hid a smile. The household was already awake around them. A woman named Myrto was grinding barley on a stone quern beneath the shelter at the side of the courtyard. The rhythmic scraping had accompanied almost every morning Theras could remember. Near her, another worker separated wool with her fingers before spinning it into thread. They were helots, people bound to the land and required to provide produce and labor to Spartan masters. Theras had grown up among them without understanding the strange mixture of dependence and distance that shaped the relationship. Myrto had wiped honey from his chin when he was small. Her husband, Eurotas, had taught him how to judge whether rain might come by watching clouds gather above the mountains. Yet Theras had also been told from his earliest memory that their lives were not the same as his. He belonged to the Spartiates, the citizen body whose adult men were expected to devote themselves to military readiness and public obligations. Eurotas belonged to a conquered population whose labor helped make that life possible. No child could fully understand such an arrangement merely because adults repeated it. Theras simply knew that Eurotas was already somewhere among the fields beyond the settlement, checking vines and watching the barley land. Myrto stopped grinding when the family prepared to leave. She looked at Theras. "Eat when food is given to you," she said. Lysandra raised an eyebrow. It was more practical advice than anyone else had offered. Theras smiled. "I will." Myrto returned to the quern. The grinding stone began its circular whisper again. Outside, Sparta was becoming busy. Later generations would imagine famous Greek cities through marble temples, crowded marketplaces, fortified gates, and high defensive walls. Sparta would disappoint anyone expecting such an entrance. There was no great wall enclosing the settlement. The city spread loosely through the valley of the Eurotas, formed from several neighboring communities that had gradually grown together. Houses, shrines, lanes, open spaces, workshops, and public buildings lay beneath the mountains rather than behind massive fortifications. To Theras, there was nothing unusual about it. Mount Taygetus was wall enough in the west, or so older men sometimes said. Beyond the houses lay fields, orchards, grazing land, and the river valley that sustained the communities of Laconia. Olive trees cast narrow shadows across pale earth. Smoke rose from cooking hearths. Somewhere nearby, a donkey complained loudly as someone loaded baskets onto its back. Theras walked between his parents. Timorata followed with a nurse and had been warned 3 times not to run ahead. They passed a potter carrying unfinished vessels from a shaded workspace. His hands were coated in pale clay. Farther along, a bronzesmith's hammer rang slowly against metal. Not everyone living under Spartan authority was a Spartiate or helot. In settlements around Laconia lived the perioikoi, the dwellers around, free communities without the political privileges of Spartan citizens. Their craftsmen and traders supplied many things the Spartiates themselves did not make. Metalwork, pottery, tools, weapons, and goods moving through ports and mountain roads depended heavily upon their labor. Theras knew some of this only because his father occasionally mentioned where a cup or spearhead had been made. The complicated structure beneath Spartan life remained mostly invisible to him. What was visible was the growing number of boys moving toward the same destination. Some walked beside fathers, others came with older brothers or male relatives. Their voices became quieter as they approached the public ground. Theras recognized several faces. There was little Mount Taygetus, who had once fallen into an irrigation ditch while trying to catch a frog. There was stout Echecratidas, whose family lived 2 lanes away. There was Brasidas, not the famous man who would bear that name generations later, but merely a solemn boy with a missing front tooth. They looked different today. Or perhaps Theras felt different while looking at them. Soon they would cease to be children encountered casually in lanes and at festivals. They would live, exercise, learn, compete, endure discipline, and grow together under supervision beyond the comfortable reach of their mothers. The education later Greeks would associate so strongly with Sparta was not simply a school in the ordinary sense. It was part of the shaping of citizen identity. Boys learned endurance, obedience, group loyalty, physical skill, songs, dances, religious customs, and the compressed manner of speech for which Spartans eventually became famous. Not every detail later writers attributed to this system belonged equally to every century. Customs changed, and outsiders sometimes exaggerated Spartan practices because Sparta fascinated them. Theras knew none of those future arguments. He only knew that the men waiting beneath the trees looked serious. One of them held a staff. Theras looked at the staff. Then he looked at his father. Agison noticed. "Discipline is easier," he said quietly, "when you do not earn it." This seemed excellent advice. Theras intended to remember it forever. He probably remembered it for less than an hour. Before the boys were gathered, families waited along the edge of the open ground. No mother wept theatrically. No father delivered a grand speech. This was not a sudden departure into an unknown wilderness. Theras would still see his family. He remained part of his household and kin. Yet something important was changing. Lysandra crouched beside him. She did not tell him to be brave. Spartan women, despite the later sayings attached to them, were real mothers rather than characters carved from stern stone. She smoothed his hair behind one ear. "Listen before you decide you understand." Theras nodded. "Share what should be shared." Another nod. "And do not believe every older boy who tells you something." Theras glanced toward the group. "Why?" "Because older boys enjoy being believed." Agison gave a quiet sound that might have been amusement. Then Lysandra stood. The official responsible for organizing the boys called them forward. Theras walked away from his parents. The earth beneath his bare feet was already warming. He took his place beside Taygetus. For several moments nobody spoke. Across the valley, sunlight had reached the lower slopes of Taygetus. Behind Theras lay his courtyard, his sister, Myrto's grinding stone, his familiar bed, and the 1,000 unnoticed comforts of childhood. Ahead lay the disciplined world that was helping transform Sparta from one powerful community among many into the dominant force of the southern Peloponnese. But history rarely feels like history while people are living it. To Theras, it felt only like a warm morning, 20 nervous boys, and a man with a wooden staff telling them to stand straight. The man with the staff waited until the boys had arranged themselves, and the longer he remained silent, the straighter they tried to stand. Theras felt Taygetus shifting beside him. A fly settled on Theras's cheek. He resisted the urge to slap it. The man was called Doron. He was not old, though to 7-year-old boys any adult who did not smile readily seemed ancient. His beard was trimmed close, his dark hair tied back, and the staff in his right hand was smooth from use rather than ornament. He walked slowly along the line, examining shoulders, feet, belts, faces, and posture. When he reached Theras, he paused. Theras stared ahead. The fly moved toward his nose. Doron continued walking. Theras exhaled. Taygetus whispered, "It likes you." Theras nearly laughed. The staff tapped the ground once. Both boys became silent. Their first lesson was not running, wrestling, or marching. It was standing where they had been told to stand. That surprised Theras. He had expected something grander. Older boys sometimes spoke of contests, cold nights, hard exercise, and endurance as though the education of a Spartan began with immediate trials. Instead, Doron spent much of that morning putting 20 children into orderly groups. He moved them, counted them, moved them again, asked their names, corrected their positions, made them wait. Then he instructed them to walk across the field together without colliding, racing, wandering, or turning the exercise into a game. The attempt failed almost immediately. Echecratidas stepped on another boy's heel. Antalcidas drifted sideways. Brasidas walked faster than everyone near him. Theras turned his head because he heard a mule braying in the lane. Doron called them back. Again. The second attempt was scarcely better. On the third, they began to understand that the task was not merely to move themselves from one place to another. Each boy had to notice where the others were. Theras shortened his step when Antalcidas fell behind. Brasidas finally matched the pace of the line. The group crossed the dusty field and stopped near an olive tree. Doron nodded once. The boys looked pleased. Again. Their pleasure faded. By midday, the simple act of moving together had become more exhausting than Theras thought walking could possibly be. His stomach began to complain. Breakfast at home seemed very far away. The boys were eventually led beneath a long shaded shelter where benches stood beside a plain table. Their meal was waiting in baskets and bowls, coarse barley bread, figs, cheese, and onions. Theras immediately remembered Myrto's advice. Eat when food is given to you. He sat beside Antalcidas and reached for bread. An older boy standing nearby stopped him. Wait. Theras withdrew his hand. The older boy could not have been more than 12, but he carried himself with the enormous dignity of someone entrusted with authority over younger children. His name was Agesippos. He checked that each small group was seated properly before giving them permission to begin. Then the food disappeared with remarkable speed. Theras had eaten barley bread all his life. It was the ordinary grain of much of the Greek world, better suited than wheat to many soils, and an essential part of daily food. At home it could be accompanied by olives, greens, cheese, fruit, or whatever else was available. Today the bread tasted unusually good. Hunger improved it. He finished his piece and looked toward the basket. Agesippos saw him. No. Theras lowered his hand. Antalcidas still had half a fig. Theras considered asking for it. Then he remembered his mother. Share what should be shared. Unfortunately, he could not decide whether this meant Antalcidas should share the fig with him, or Theras should learn not to desire it. He drank water instead. Around them, older groups were arriving and leaving. Some boys wore only short cloaks or simple garments suitable for exercise. Others had dust on their knees and shoulders after wrestling. A few moved through the space with the confident familiarity of people who had belonged here for years. Theras watched them. One group sat in a circle while an instructor asked questions. The answers were short, sometimes very short. A boy who spoke too long was interrupted. Spartan education valued memory and speech, but not elaborate display. Later, Greeks would admire what they regarded as the characteristic Spartan answer. Concise, pointed, and stripped of unnecessary words. The very region around Sparta, Laconia, would eventually give another age the word laconic. For now, Theras merely observed that the older boys appeared to have learned how to answer adults without wandering into stories. He was less skilled at this. Doron discovered that after the meal. The younger boys sat under the trees while he questioned them one at a time. Theras. Theras looked up. What makes a good companion? He thought. Someone who shared figs seemed a promising answer. Someone who helps you, he said. How? When you need help. Doron waited. Theras became uncomfortable. If you fall, he continued, he might pull you up. Or if you lose something, he can find it. Or if there are two baskets and one is heavy. Doron raised a hand. Theras stopped. You gave the answer before the examples. Yes. Then keep the answer. A few boys smiled. Theras felt his ears warming. Doron turned to Antalcidas. What makes a poor companion? Antalcidas glanced at Theras. One who talks too much. The group burst into laughter. Even Doron's expression softened. Theras elbowed Antalcidas later, very gently, and only when the instructor was looking away. The afternoon brought exercise. Nothing resembled the perfect formations that poets and chroniclers would later associate with Spartan armies. These were children learning their bodies. They ran short distances, jumped across marked lines, threw small stones toward a target, balanced on narrow beams, and practiced falling without striking their heads. Theras enjoyed running. He did not enjoy wrestling. His first partner was Echecratidas. Echecratidas had the unfortunate advantage of being shaped like a storage jar. Theras wrapped both arms around him and pushed. Echecratidas barely moved. Then Echecratidas leaned forward. Theras landed in the dust. He stared upward at the blue sky. An olive leaf drifted past his face. Doron appeared above him. Are you injured? No. Then why are you still there? Theras rose. They tried again. He fell again. On the third attempt, he stopped pushing directly. He moved to one side as Echecratidas came forward, caught the other boy off balance, and sent them both rolling onto the ground. Neither had achieved anything elegant, but Doron nodded. Better. That single word pleased Theras more than he expected. Near the end of the session, the boys were taken to water. They washed dust from their faces and arms in shallow basins, rather than being allowed to splash wildly. By then, the shadows had stretched across the field. Theras wondered whether his mother had begun the evening meal. The thought brought an ache that was not hunger. He had never spent such a long day under the direction of strangers. Yet he had also never spent a day surrounded almost entirely by boys his own age. They were already learning one another's peculiarities. Brasidas was fast but impatient. Echecratidas was difficult to move. Antalcidas could turn almost any instruction into a joke if Doron was far enough away. A thin boy called Cleon had astonishing balance. Another, Menisarchos, rarely spoke at all. As the light softened, Agasippos led them toward the place where they would rest. Theras expected a building. Instead, he found a modest communal space with simple sleeping places arranged close together. For boys at the beginning of their training, the arrangements were not yet the severe conditions described for older youths. Customs of the Spartan system varied by age and changed over time, and the harshest practices associated with it belonged to later stages or to accounts written by observers fascinated by Spartan austerity. Still, the difference from home was enormous. There was no private corner, no familiar chest, no sound of Timareta talking to herself before sleep. Theras touched the folded cloak provided for him. It smelled faintly of smoke and wool. Agasippos showed the boys where they should leave their few belongings. "You keep your place in order," he said. "What happens if we don't?" Antalcidas asked. Agasippos looked at him. "You discover why keeping it in order was easier." Antalcidas nodded gravely. Theras suspected he had just heard a better answer than anything he had managed beneath the trees. They would not remain there every moment of their childhood. Family ties, religious observances, civic festivals, and household connections continued. Spartan upbringing did not erase parents, but it shifted the center of a boy's life. The household had been Theras's first world. Now the citizen community was beginning to claim more of him. That evening, before darkness settled fully, the younger boys were led back outside. The air had cooled. Across the open ground, adult men were assembling in small groups before going to their common messes. Theras immediately searched the figures. He found his father by the Red Cloak. Agason was speaking with two men. Theras wanted to call. He did not. Perhaps his father sensed the watching eyes because he turned. For a moment, father and son looked across the distance between them. Agason did not come over. He simply lifted his chin once. Theras copied him. Then the men continued toward their evening meal. The common dining groups, the Syssitia, were one of the institutions that separated a full Spartan citizen's life from that of many other Greeks. Adult male citizens contributed food and ate regularly with their mess companions. Membership bound men together beyond household and kin, reinforcing the collective discipline expected from those who stood beside one another in war and public life. Much of what they ate came ultimately from estates worked by helot families. Barley, wine, cheese, figs, meat when available or appropriate. The famous black broth associated with Sparta would become one of the details outsiders most enjoyed discussing, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with disgust. To the people who consumed such meals, however, food in the common mess was not intended primarily as luxury. It was part of belonging. Theras watched his father disappear between buildings. He suddenly understood something small. Agason, too, had once stood where Theras stood. His father had once been 7. The thought was so strange that Theras almost laughed. He pictured Agason losing a wrestling match, forgetting an instruction, or being told that he talked too much. The image seemed impossible. But as night approached, impossibility softened. Doron gathered the boys. Before sleep, they were taught a song. It was simple, with a repeated rhythm that made it easy to remember. The words honored discipline, courage, the city, and those who had come before. Singing and choral performance formed a significant part of Spartan culture. Music was not an opposite to martial life. It belonged within religious festivals, communal education, dancing, procession, and the ordering of movement. Sparta had a rich musical tradition. Poets and musicians from beyond Laconia had worked there in earlier generations, and festivals brought carefully trained choruses into public view. Boys learned not only to move together, but to breathe and sing together. Theras liked this far more than wrestling. His voice was not especially beautiful, and Taygetus's was worse. Halfway through the song, Theras heard a wavering note beside him and had to stare fixedly at Doron's sandals to avoid laughing. The song ended. Silence returned. Beyond the city, frogs called along the Eurotas. The boys settled into their unfamiliar sleeping places. Theras lay on his back. Beside him, Taygetus whispered, "Are you awake?" "Yes." "Do you think tomorrow has wrestling?" "Yes." A pause. "Bad." Theras smiled into the darkness. Somewhere farther away, men's voices carried through the evening air, low and indistinct. A dog barked. An animal bell sounded briefly from the direction of the fields. Theras thought about his mother's courtyard, then about Doron's question, "What makes a good companion?" His first answer still seemed correct. Someone who helps you. But after only one day, he wondered whether helping might sometimes mean matching another person's pace, holding a line, sharing a task, or singing badly beside someone so neither boy felt quite as alone. His eyes grew heavy. Before sleep found him, Theras heard Agesippos moving quietly among the rows, checking that every boy was where he should be. The new world was orderly, watchful, and strange, and on the following morning, Theras would discover that standing straight had been the easy lesson. Before dawn, Theras learned that Agesippos could wake 20 boys without raising his voice. He walked once down the sleeping space, tapping the end of a short stick against the wooden uprights that supported the roof. Talk, talk, talk. The sound was enough. Blankets shifted. Bare feet found the cold floor. Someone groaned and immediately pretended that he had not. Theras opened his eyes into darkness. For several breaths, he had no idea where he was. Then came the smell of wool, dust, old smoke, and sleeping boys, and memory returned all at once. His first day, the wrestling, the song, his father's red cloak disappearing between the buildings. Agesippos passed again. Outside. Theras sat up. Beside him, Taygetus had wrapped his cloak around his head. Theras pulled it away. "You heard him?" "I hoped I dreamed him." They dressed quickly. The morning air struck them as soon as they stepped outdoors. Summer days in the Eurotas valley could become hot beneath the Laconian sun, but before sunrise the air descending from Taygetus still carried a mountain chill. Theras rubbed his forearms. Doron was waiting. He looked entirely unaffected by the cold. Theras suspected this was another skill adults learned and refused to explain to children. The boys assembled. A pale line had appeared above the eastern ridges, but stars were still visible. Doron led them away from the sleeping quarters and along a path toward open ground. No one spoke. Not because silence had been ordered. They were simply too sleepy. At first, Theras thought the lesson would be running. Instead, Doron stopped them near a patch of rough earth scattered with stones, dry grass, and low shrubs. Shoes off, Theras looked down. He was already barefoot. Several boys were not. Those who had sandals removed them. Doron pointed ahead. "You will walk to the fig tree." The tree stood perhaps 200 paces away. Theras waited. That was all. No formation was required. No racing. They began. The ground immediately made sense of the lesson. Small stones pressed into the soles of Theras's feet. Dry stems scratched his ankles. In one place the earth dipped unexpectedly and he nearly stumbled. Doron walked beside them. Look where you place your feet." Theras looked down. Not only there. Theras looked up again. He began to understand. The pathless ground required attention both near and far. A boy staring only at his feet could walk into another boy. A boy staring only ahead could step badly. By the time they reached the fig tree, the eastern sky had become gold. Doron turned them around. Back. Taygetus sighed. The second crossing hurt less. Or perhaps Theras had simply learned where to step. Spartan boys were encouraged to become physically hardy, but the purpose was not discomfort for its own sake. The ideal celebrated by the citizen community was usefulness. Bodies able to travel, endure heat and cold, move across difficult terrain, and remain steady when conditions were unpleasant. To later observers, some Spartan customs would appear deliberately severe. To Doron, this morning's exercise was practical. A man who could not cross rough ground without twisting his ankle was not improved by having suffered dramatically on the way. When they returned, the boys were taken to wash. Breakfast was smaller than Theras wished. Barley, a little cheese, water. He ate slowly this time, hoping slowness might somehow create more food. It did not. Afterward, Doron brought them into a shaded courtyard where an older man sat on a low stool holding a small wooden tablet. His name was Phrynon. Theras studied him with interest. Until that morning, most of the men supervising the boys had looked as though they could lift him with one hand. Phrynon was narrow-shouldered, gray-bearded, and moved carefully because one knee troubled him. Yet when Doron entered, he greeted the older man respectfully. "This is Phrynon," he told the boys. "You will listen to him." Phrynon smiled. This made him immediately suspicious. "Doron says that," the old man said, "because he knows you will not always listen to him." A few boys laughed. Doron departed. Phrynon placed the tablet beside him. "Who can tell me what his grandfather remembers?" The boys stared. Theras had expected letters. Instead, Phrynon pointed to Brasidas. "You," Brasidas thought. "My grandfather remembers a flood." "Where?" "Near Amyclae." "What happened?" "The river rose." "And?" Brasidas hesitated. "He said a goat was found in a tree." Phrynon nodded. "An important goat?" "No." "Then why does he remember it?" Brasidas had no answer. Phrynon looked around the group. "Because people remember pictures." He pointed toward his own head. "A goat in a tree remains here longer than 10 baskets washed away." Theras liked Phrynon. The old man spent the morning teaching through memory. He recited short lines of poetry and had the boys repeat them. Then he changed a word and asked who noticed. Cleon noticed almost everything. Echecratidas noticed almost nothing. Theras was somewhere between. Literacy existed in Sparta, as elsewhere in the Greek world, but education there placed strong emphasis on memorization, music, oral performance, and communal instruction. Boys might encounter written letters and simple texts, yet the admired Spartan citizen was not trained to become a professional scribe. Words had to live in the mind. Songs especially. Phrynon gave them a verse about the Dioscuri, the divine twins Castor and Polydeuces, whom Spartans honored deeply. The boys repeated it, then again, then standing, then while walking slowly around the courtyard. Theras discovered that a line remembered easily while sitting could disappear entirely once someone told him to move his feet at the same time. Phrynon seemed delighted by this. "Your mind belongs in your body," he said. "Do not train one and leave the other asleep." By midday, Theras knew the verse. He would remember parts of it for the rest of his life. Not because the words were complicated, but because Taygetus mistakenly replaced one phrase with another that made Castor sound as though he were chasing a chicken. Even Phrynon laughed. After the meal, the boys were released for a short rest. Theras lay beneath an olive tree. Cicadas had begun their dry summer music. Taygetus was beside him, attempting to balance a twig on his upper lip. "Your grandfather," Theras said. Taygetus kept perfectly still. "What about him? What does he remember?" The twig fell. "A lot." "Like what?" Taygetus frowned. Theras waited. "My grandfather says things were better when he was young." "What things?" "Everything." Theras considered this. "That is not useful." "He thinks it is." They both laughed. Across the yard, Menisarchos sat alone, turning something small between his fingers. Theras watched him. The quiet boy had barely spoken since the previous morning. Theras got up. Taygetus followed. Menisarchos closed his hand when they approached. "What is it?" Theras asked. Menisarchos opened his fingers. A small disk of baked clay rested on his palm. A horse had been scratched into one side. It was crude, but recognizable. "My brother made it." "Why?" Menisarchos shrugged. "He makes things." "Is he here?" "No." Theras waited. Menisarchos looked at the little horse. "He cannot be." That answer stopped both boys. Not every boy born into a Spartiate household followed the same path successfully. Citizenship depended upon conditions that were demanding and, in later life, expensive. Families could lose status. Physical circumstances, household fortune, political standing, and the complex categories of Spartan society created lives far less uniform than later legends suggested. Theras did not know what prevented Menisarchos' brother from being among the citizen-trained boys. He sensed only that asking would be rude. "It is a good horse," he said. Menisarchos looked surprised. Then he put the disc away. The afternoon took them beyond the training ground. Doron led the group toward the Eurotas. This time they walked without formation. Theras noticed immediately that the morning's lesson had changed him. He watched the ground. Not constantly, just enough. Their route passed cultivated land outside the central settlements. Here the structure supporting Spartan citizen life became visible. Workers were pruning vines. Others carried tools between plots. An ox pulled a simple plow across a dry field being prepared for later cultivation. Theras recognized Eurotas before Eurotas noticed him. "Myrto's husband," he whispered to Taygetus. Eurotas was standing beside an irrigation channel, clearing reeds from the edge with a hooked tool. He looked up. Their eyes met. At home, Theras would have run toward him. Here he did not. Eurotas gave him a small nod. Theras returned it. The group continued. Something about the exchange unsettled him. Not because Eurotas had behaved differently, because Theras had. Yesterday they had belonged to the same familiar landscape of home. Today, an invisible line had appeared between them. Theras was beginning to move more deeply into the world of Spartiate boys, while Eurotas remained tied to fields whose produce supported households like his. The distinction had always existed. Theras was simply old enough to begin seeing it. At the river, Doron allowed them to drink and wash their faces. The Eurotas was not a vast river, but to people living in its valley it shaped the land. Reeds clustered along its banks, plane trees and other vegetation offered shade. Frogs vanished into the shallows as the boys approached. Doron sat on a stone. "What feeds Sparta?" he asked. "Barley," said Echecratidas. Several boys laughed. Doron did not. "What else?" "The river," Cleon said. "Rain." "Olives." "Helots," said Brasidas. The word changed the mood slightly. Doron looked across the water. "Yes." He picked up a pebble. "A citizen who believes food appears because he deserves it is a fool." Theras remembered Myrto grinding barley before sunrise. Doron tossed the pebble into the river. "There are many kinds of dependence. Learn to see them." He said nothing more. That evening, Theras thought about the sentence while the boys ate. Dependence. He had never used the word. Yet he depended upon Myrto for bread, Eurotas for crops, his mother for almost everything he had known until yesterday, Doron for instruction, Taygetus for companionship, and strangers in surrounding communities for objects he used without knowing who made them. Perhaps Sparta's reputation for self-sufficient warriors concealed a quieter truth that children could see more easily than adults admitted. No person stood alone. After sunset, Agesippos inspected the sleeping places. Theras arranged his cloak carefully. Then he lay down. His feet were sore. His stomach was only partly satisfied. His mind, however, was crowded with the goat in Brasidas' grandfather's tree, Menesarchos' clay horse, Eurotas beside the irrigation channel, and Doron's pebble disappearing beneath dark water. Antalcidas whispered from the next place. "Theras? What? If tomorrow begins with walking on stones, I am refusing." Theras smiled. "No, you aren't." A long pause followed. Then Antalcidas sighed. "No." Outside, the night insects moved through the warm air. Theras closed his eyes, and before sleep reached him, he began repeating Phryneon's verse in silence, careful this time not to turn a divine twin into a man chasing chickens. The next morning did not begin with stones. It began with reeds. Doron led the boys toward the Eurotas soon after breakfast, when the sun was still low enough to cast long shadows from the plane trees. Each boy carried a small knife suitable for cutting plants, and Agesippos walked behind them with a coil of cord over one shoulder. Antalcidas inspected his knife. "Are we building something?" "No," said Doron. "Then why—" "You will know when you know." Antalcidas glanced at Theras. Theras kept his face carefully blank. He was beginning to appreciate how often asking Doron a question merely delayed the answer. They followed the riverbank until they reached a broad patch of reeds growing above the damp ground. Dragonflies flickered between the stems. Frogs moved invisibly in the shallows, announcing themselves with sudden splashes. Doron stopped. "Cut enough for your sleeping places." The boys stared at him. Theras understood first, their bedding. Until now, simple materials had already been arranged for the youngest group. Today they would begin learning to provide part of it themselves. Doron demonstrated how to choose reeds that were dry enough to use and how to cut them without crushing the stems. "Not the greenest," he said. "They bend badly and hold too much moisture. Not the rotten ones either. Look before you cut." Again, looking. Theras was beginning to suspect that half of Spartan education consisted of adults telling boys to notice things they had previously ignored. He entered the reeds with Antalcidas. The ground beneath them was cool and soft. Mud pressed between Theras's toes. He selected a tall stem, cut it, and examined the pale interior. Antalcidas was attacking an entire clump. "You need enough for one bed," Theras said. "I am making a magnificent bed. You have nowhere to put a magnificent bed." Antalcidas stopped cutting. This had apparently not occurred to him. Across the patch, Echecratidas sneezed so violently that 3 boys began laughing. Doron made them continue. By the time the sun cleared the trees, each boy had a bundle. They carried the reeds back toward the training ground. Theras quickly discovered that gathering something was often easier than carrying it. The stems slipped apart. Their dry leaves scratched his neck. Twice he had to stop and retie the cord Agesippos had shown him how to use. Menesarchos, walking beside him, had made a neat bundle that remained perfectly secure. "How?" Theras asked. "My brother showed me knots." The clay horse came briefly to Theras's mind. "What kind?" Menesarchos shifted his bundle. "Mostly ones for fishing nets." Theras wanted to ask more about the brother who could not train with them, but he remembered their earlier conversation and restrained himself. Instead he said, "Show me later." Menesarchos nodded. That small agreement mattered. The boys were gradually discovering that useful knowledge did not always come from the official instructors. It passed sideways as well, from child to child, family to family, worker to worker. Back at the sleeping space, Agesippos showed them how to arrange the reeds. The work was ordinary. That was precisely why Theras enjoyed it. For once, no one was measuring his speed or correcting his posture. He bent stems, flattened uneven places, replaced pieces that cracked, and tested the surface with his palm. His first effort developed an uncomfortable hollow in the middle. He rebuilt it. Mount Taygetus's magnificent bed proved too high and collapsed when he sat on it. Theras laughed until Agesippos told him to help. Together they repaired it. Later traditions would make much of Spartan boys sleeping on beds of reeds gathered from the Eurotas, sometimes describing older youths cutting the plants with their bare hands rather than tools. Whether every detail belonged to every period was another matter. Spartan customs evolved, and authors who wrote about them often described an idealized system rather than the daily experience of every generation. But simplicity of bedding fitted a wider expectation. Comfort was not forbidden. Dependence upon comfort was discouraged. When Theras lay briefly on the finished reeds, they were less pleasant than his bed at home, but better than he had expected. They smelled of river water and dry grass. "You see," said Taygetus from beside him, "magnificent." His repaired bedding was now slightly thinner than everyone else's. Theras decided not to mention this. Before midday, Phrynon arrived. This time he carried no tablet. He brought a lyre. The boys gathered immediately. Even Doron remained at the edge of the courtyard. The instrument was not large. Its wooden frame had been polished smooth by long handling, and the strings gave a soft note when Phrynon tested them with his fingers. Theras had heard lyres many times at festivals and household gatherings, but he had never been allowed this close to one used by a practiced musician. Phrynon plucked a string. "What is this for?" "Songs," said Brasidas. "What else?" "Dancing," Cleon said. "What else?" Nobody answered. Phrynon looked toward Doron. Doron said nothing. "Keep in time," the old man told them. He played a short rhythm. "Men who cannot hear one another do not move together well." He played it again. The boys clapped. Too quickly. Phrynon stopped. Again. This time they matched him for several beats before Echecratidas lost the rhythm and tried to catch up by clapping twice as fast. Phrynon sighed. "Echecratidas, if your companions are wrong, joining them at twice the speed does not make you right." The boys laughed. Then they tried again. Music occupied a place in Spartan life that later images of a purely martial society could obscure. Choral song, dance, poetry, and religious celebration were woven deeply into communal identity. Earlier generations in Sparta had welcomed poets such as Tyrtaeus and musicians associated with important developments in Greek musical culture. At festivals, trained groups performed songs and dances that required discipline no less exact than physical drill. Theras did not think of culture. He thought of the beat. 4 slow claps, 2 quicker ones. Pause. Again. When the boys could repeat it reliably, Phrynon made them walk. Theras nearly collided with Cleon. "Your feet," Phrynon said, "should know what your ears know." They began again. By midday, 20 boys crossed the courtyard in rhythm. It was not a military formation. It was a game with purpose. Theras found himself enjoying the moment when separate footsteps became one sound. After their meal, the training ground grew quiet during the hottest part of the day. The boys rested under shade while adults withdrew from the strongest sun. Theras was almost asleep when Agesippos touched his shoulder. "Your mother is here." He sat up so quickly that he struck his head against the tree trunk. Taygetus laughed. Theras ignored him. Lysandra waited near the edge of the grounds with Timareta beside her. His sister held a small basket. For a moment, Theras forgot every lesson about measured movement and nearly ran. He stopped himself after 3 steps. Lysandra noticed. Her expression changed very slightly. He could not tell whether she was pleased or amused. Timareta solved the matter by running toward him instead. She wrapped both arms around his waist. You smell like a river." "I was in a river." "Did you fall?" "No." "You look as though you fell." Theras looked down. Mud still marked one knee. Lysandra approached. She touched his shoulder, then his hair. Nothing dramatic had happened to him during the few days apart, but she examined him with the careful attention of someone checking a precious object she was pretending not to worry about. "How are your feet?" "Fine." "Eating?" "Yes." "Enough?" Theras hesitated. Lysandra smiled. "So, no. We eat enough." "That was not what I asked." Theras suspected Phrynon would have approved of her questioning. Timareta opened the basket. Inside were small cakes made from barley meal, cheese, and a little honey. Theras's eyes widened. Then he remembered the rules. He looked toward Agesippos. The older boy stood several paces away. "May I?" Agesippos glanced into the basket. "You may share them." Timareta frowned. "They are his." "They are his to share." Theras understood before she did. He carried the basket back beneath the trees. Antalcidas appeared instantly. So did Echecratidas. Then Brasidas. Theras counted the cakes. There were not enough for everyone to have a whole one. His first feeling was disappointment. His second was calculation. He broke each cake into smaller pieces. The honey made his fingers sticky. Soon every boy in the group had something. Even Menasarchos accepted a piece after hesitating. Theras saved the smallest portion for himself. It tasted better than anything he had eaten in days. Lysandra watched from the edge of the courtyard. She did not praise him. She did not need to. Before leaving, Timareta inspected the reed bedding. "You sleep on this?" "Yes." She pressed it with both hands. "My bed is better." "Yes." "I can have yours now." "No." She grinned. Theras realized she had been waiting several days to ask again. Lysandra called her. Timareta ran back. Theras remained where he was as his mother prepared to leave. For an instant, he wanted to follow. Home was close enough to imagine in exact detail. The courtyard at dusk, the jars along the storeroom wall, his mother sorting wool, the familiar voices of Myrto and Eurotas, Timareta taking whatever object he had just put down. Lysandra looked at him. "Listen before you decide you understand," she said softly. The same words as the first morning. Theras nodded. Then she and Timareta walked away. He watched until they disappeared among the lanes. That evening, Doran took the boys to a place overlooking part of the settlement. Smoke drifted upward from household hearths. Farther away, the Eurotas caught the last light. Beyond it lay cultivated ground stretching toward the eastern hills. Doran sat with them. For once, no exercise followed. "Tell me what you saw today," he said. "Reeds," Antalcidas answered. "Your own hands," said Doran. Antalcidas blinked. Doran turned to Cleon. "Music." "Your companions." To Brasidas. "Food." The work behind it. Then he looked at Theras. Theras thought of his mother, his sister. Menasarchos' knot, Phryon's rhythm. 20 pieces of honey cake becoming enough. "Sharing," he said. Doran waited. Theras nearly added an explanation. Then he remembered his first lesson in answering. He stopped. Doran nodded. "Good." Below them, Sparta entered evening without gates closing or watchmen appearing on towering walls. Its strength, the Spartans believed, rested less in masonry than in the people shaped to defend and sustain the community. Theras was beginning to understand that such shaping happened in very small acts. A knot tied correctly, a step matched to another, a piece of food divided, a question answered with only the words required. When he lay down that night, the reeds shifted beneath him. They were not comfortable, but they were his work. Across the room, Antalcidas whispered that his magnificent bed had developed another hole. Theras smiled in the darkness. "Tomorrow," he whispered back. And, for the first time since leaving his household, the word did not sound entirely like something happening far from home. Tomorrow brought Theras home. not permanently. Doron announced it after the boys had washed and eaten. You will spend the day with your households. Return before the evening meal. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. Then Antalcidas grinned so widely that the expression seemed to occupy his entire face. Doron looked at him. You are still expected to return. The grin diminished slightly. Theras felt a sudden mixture of delight and uncertainty. Only a handful of days had passed, yet home belonged in his mind to an earlier version of himself, the boy who had never cut reeds for his own bedding, never crossed rough ground because an instructor demanded it, and never divided a honey cake into 20 pieces. He collected his few things. Menesarchos came beside him before they separated. You wanted the knot. Theras remembered. Menesarchos took a short cord and looped it slowly around 2 reed stems. His fingers moved with confidence, crossing one end beneath the other before tightening the binding. Theras attempted it. The knot slipped apart. Again, Menesarchos said. Theras tried a second time. Better. On the third attempt, the stems held. You pull here, Menesarchos explained, pointing. Not there. Theras studied the finished knot. Your brother taught you? Yes. What is his name? Menesarchos hesitated only briefly. Damas. Theras nodded. He asked nothing more. It was enough to know the name. Then the boys scattered toward their families. Theras walked quickly through the lanes, restraining himself from running only because he knew how ridiculous it would be to stumble on his first morning away from supervision. The city looked different. That surprised him more than anything. Nothing had changed. The same houses stood beside the same dusty lanes. The bronze-smith's workshop rang with hammer blows. Women carried water. A dog slept beneath a cart. Beyond a low wall, 2 men argued quietly over the ownership of a wandering goat. Yet Theras noticed things he had passed without thought before. He saw a perioikos craftsman unloading pottery from a donkey. He saw a helot woman carrying a basket of onions toward a household. He heard several men discussing contributions to their dining group. Sparta had not altered. His attention had. When he reached the courtyard, Timareta was sitting on the ground with a wooden doll. She looked up. For one perfect moment she stared at him. Then she shouted, Theras! She ran across the courtyard and struck him with enough force to make him take a step backward. You came back. I said I would. You were gone a very long time. It was not very long. It was. He considered arguing, then decided that 5-year-olds measured time differently. Lysandra emerged from the storeroom. She was holding a wax tablet used for household reckoning. Unlike Timareta, she did not run. She smiled. That was enough. Theras crossed the courtyard and embraced her. She smelled of wool and olive oil. For several breaths, the discipline of Doron's training ground ceased to matter. He was simply her son. When he stepped back, Lysandra touched the side of his face. You have become thin. I have not. All mothers say that. Even when it is not true. Especially then. Myrto appeared near the grinding stone. Theras remembered seeing Eurotas at the irrigation channel. Myrto. She looked at him. So they returned you. For today. She inspected him with exaggerated seriousness. Both ears? Yes. Both feet? Yes. Then they have done reasonably well. Theras laughed. The quern stood nearby, and for the first time he noticed the grain waiting beside it as something more than part of the household scenery. How long do you grind in the morning? Myrto paused. What? The barley. She studied him. As long as there is barley needing to be ground. No, I mean, how long? Myrto rested one hand on the upper stone. It depends. On how much flour is needed. On whether this stone decides to behave. On whether your sister has hidden anything inside the grain basket. I did that once, Timareta announced. We know. Theras crouched beside the quern. Can I try? Myrto looked toward Lysandra. His mother said nothing. That meant permission. Myrto showed him how to grip the handle and rotate the upper stone. Theras pushed. The stone moved reluctantly. He pushed harder. Grain cracked between the surfaces with the familiar scraping sound that had filled his childhood mornings. Around. Again. Around. After only a short while, his shoulders began to ache. Myrto watched him. You thought flour grew inside jars. No. Good. She took the handle from him. Her movements were smoother, using the weight of her body rather than fighting the stone with her arms. Theras noticed the difference. Doron would have noticed too. Eurotas says he saw you near the river, Myrto said. I saw him. He said you walked past like a magistrate. Theras looked down. I was with the group. I know. There was no anger in her voice. That made him more uncomfortable. He remembered the invisible line he had felt between himself and Eurotas. Was I rude? Myrto considered the question. No. Theras waited. She resumed grinding. But noticing someone and greeting someone are not always the same thing. The stone whispered around again. Theras stored the sentence beside Doron's remarks about dependence. He was discovering that adults often gave their most important lessons while pretending not to teach. Agison returned before midday. Theras heard his voice from outside and went to meet him. His father was carrying a spear, not a ceremonial weapon, but the familiar equipment of a citizen who practiced regularly with his companions. Its long wooden shaft was smooth from handling, and the iron spearhead had been protected for transport. Agison set it against the wall. How is Doron? Strict. Good. Theras frowned. You would say that. I chose the word before you did. Agison washed his hands from a basin. Theras watched the spear. Can I hold it? No. Why? Because you asked. Theras stared at him. Agison almost smiled. Then he lifted the weapon and handed it over horizontally. Theras took it with both hands. The weight surprised him. Spears used by Greek hoplites had to combine reach and strength without becoming impossible to manage. The shaft was far longer than Theras was tall, and even holding it still required effort. He imagined carrying it beneath the sun, marching, keeping formation, using a shield at the same time. His earlier exercises suddenly seemed smaller pieces of something larger. Heavy, he said. Yes. How do you hold it for a long time? You practice. Theras looked at his father. That answer sounded suspiciously like Doron. Agison took the spear back. A shield will teach you more. Because it is heavier? Because it is not only yours. Theras waited. His father rested the spear against the wall. In a close formation, your shield protects part of the man beside you. His protects part of you. Theras thought of the boys learning to walk together on their first morning. Like matching steps. Agison nodded. Yes. That pleased Theras enormously. Not because he had understood warfare. He had understood Doron. After the midday meal, Agison went to meet other citizens, and Lysandra took Theras with her to inspect household stores. This was work Theras had usually considered dull. Now he paid attention. Large pottery jars held grain, oil, dried fruit, and other provisions. Wool waited in bundles. Baskets had to be checked for damp or pests. Clay containers were marked or positioned so that people knew what they contained. Lysandra kept records with the help of simple marks and memory. The running of a Spartiate household was not a minor matter. Spartan women could possess and manage property to an extent unusual in parts of the Greek world, particularly because men spent so much of their adult lives occupied with military and communal responsibilities. Over generations, inheritance patterns would make women significant holders of land and wealth in Laconia. Theras saw none of that as remarkable. His mother had always given instructions. People had always listened. She stopped beside an oil jar. How long would this last? Theras stared at it. I don't know. Then guess. A month? With how many people using it? Theras frowned. Lysandra waited. He began counting the household in his head. Family, workers, visitors, cooking, lamps, religious offerings, oil used for bodies after exercise. A jar was no longer simply a jar. It was days of labor, olives gathered and pressed, storage carefully managed, and decisions about how much could be used. "I don't know," he said again. Lysandra nodded. "That is a better answer." Theras looked at her. "Better than guessing." "Better than pretending knowledge you do not have." He smiled. "Doron would like that." "I knew Doron before you did." This revelation was astonishing. "You did?" "Sparta existed before you were 7, Theras." Timareta, who had followed them into the storeroom, laughed. Theras ignored her. Late in the afternoon, he knew it was time to return. The knowledge settled over the household quietly. No one announced it. Lysandra packed nothing for him. He needed little. Timareta accompanied him to the doorway. "You can stay." "No." "You could hide." "Doron would find me." "Where?" Theras considered. "Everywhere." Timareta accepted this description of Doron without difficulty. Myrto called to him from the courtyard. "Theras." He turned. "Tomorrow, if you see Eurotas." Theras knew what she meant. "I'll greet him." Myrto nodded. Then he left. The evening light lay warm across Sparta as he returned through the settlement. Ahead, several boys were converging on the same path. And Taygetus came running from one lane. "My mother fed me until I thought I would die." Theras laughed. "Mine said I was thin." "So did mine." They decided this must be another mysterious agreement among mothers. At the training ground, Menasarkos was already there. Theras picked up 2 loose reed stems from beside the sleeping place. He tied them using the knot he had learned that morning. It held. Menasarkos noticed but said nothing. He only smiled. When Doron assembled them before the evening meal, he looked around the group. "Did you learn anything at home?" Antiochus raised his hand. "My mother thinks I am starving." Several boys laughed. Doron waited until they stopped. Then Theras raised his hand. "A shield is not only yours." Doron looked at him for a moment. "No," he said. The boys became quiet. Theras sensed that this answer mattered. Doron glanced along the line. "Remember that." They went to eat. Afterward, darkness gathered over the valley. Theras settled onto the reeds he had made with his own hands. Home no longer felt like a place he had left behind. Nor did the training ground feel quite separate from it. The 2 worlds were beginning to join. The barley in Myrto's quern, the oil in Lysandra's jars, Aegison's spear, Menasarkos's knot, the boy standing beside him in formation. All belonged to the same complicated city. And as Theras listened to the others settling for sleep, he began to sense what Sparta expected him to learn long before anyone placed a real shield on his arm. A man might carry his own weight, but he never carried only himself. The following weeks taught Theras that growing accustomed to a place did not make its mornings arrive any later. Agesipos's tapping still came before sunrise. The boys still rose reluctantly. Antiochus still attempted, with remarkable persistence, to bargain with time itself by remaining motionless beneath his cloak for several breaths after everyone else had stood. But the sleeping space no longer seemed strange. Theras could find his belt in darkness. He knew which reed in his bedding creaked when he turned. He knew that Brasidas sometimes muttered in his sleep, and that Echecratidas woke hungry regardless of how much he had eaten the night before. Routine had begun to settle around them. Then, one morning, Doron changed it. After breakfast, he led the boys northward through Sparta instead of toward the training grounds. They passed households already busy with work. Wool hung from a wooden frame in one courtyard. A woman carried a water jar carefully against her hip. Near a workshop, charcoal smoke drifted into the lane, carrying the sharp smell of heated metal. Theras expected Doron to explain their destination. He did not. The boys had learned not to ask too quickly. They crossed an open area where several older men were speaking beneath the shade of trees. Beyond them, the settlement widened toward places Theras knew mostly from festivals and journeys with his family. At last, Taygetus whispered, "Are we going to the sanctuary?" Theras looked ahead. He thought so. Doron heard. Yes, that was all. Their destination lay near the Eurotas, at the sanctuary associated with Artemis Orthia, one of the most important cult places in Spartan life. To Theras, the sanctuary was not mysterious. He had visited it with his family before. He remembered offerings, songs, adults standing more solemnly than usual, and the smell of smoke from sacrifice. Today, however, he entered as part of his group. That changed the place. The precinct was simple compared with the grand temples travelers might admire elsewhere in Greece. Sacred places grew and changed across generations, and the sanctuary had already accumulated layers of use before Theras was born. People had worshipped here for a long time. Small objects offered to the goddess had passed through countless hands: lead figurines, pottery, ornaments, carved pieces, and humble gifts that carried private hopes into a public sacred space. Theras noticed a man arranging small offerings near a table. Some were shaped like animals. He immediately thought of Menasarkos's clay horse. Menasarkos saw them too. For a moment, his hand moved toward the place beneath his tunic where he sometimes kept his brother's disc. Then it stopped. Doron gathered the boys. "You know where you are." No one answered. "This place belongs to the gods, to the city, and to memory. Behave accordingly." Theras understood enough not to whisper. They watched preparations for a small religious observance involving older youths. Religion in Sparta did not sit apart from civic life. Sacrifices, processions, festivals, songs, omens, and sacred calendars shaped the rhythm of public activity. Military decisions could be delayed or guided by religious obligations. Kings held priestly responsibilities. Families maintained domestic rights while the community honored deities whose worship helped define Spartan identity. For the boys, learning Sparta meant learning its sacred habits as surely as learning to run. An elderly attendant showed them where water was used for purification. Phrynon appeared soon afterward. Theras was delighted to see the lyre beneath his arm. Taygetus looked less delighted when Phrynon announced that they would sing. "You remember the rhythm?" 20 boys answered together. "Yes." Phrynon tilted his head. That was not the rhythm. They smiled. He arranged them in 2 groups. Theras stood beside Menasarkos and Cleon. They began with a melody the boys had practiced several times during previous days. Its pattern was simple, but performing it in the sanctuary changed the sound. Voices seemed to travel differently through the open precinct, mixing with birds, river wind, and the quiet movements of adults nearby. Phrynon stopped them. "Listen." They waited. "To yourselves?" No one answered. "To one another." Again. The second attempt was better. Theras heard Taygetus's uncertain voice from the other group, and adjusted his own when the melody began to drift. They sang until Phrynon was satisfied. Afterward, the old man sat beneath the shade and let them rest. Theras looked toward the older youths. One was carrying a wooden object used in the preparations. Another helped arrange branches. Nobody appeared hurried. "What happens at the festival?" Echecratidas asked. Phrynon rubbed his troublesome knee. "Which festival?" "The one here. There is more than one observance here." Echecratidas frowned. Phrynon smiled. Theras had noticed that teachers often enjoyed discovering how imprecise a child's question could be. Phrynon told them about songs, dances, contests, and rituals connected with Artemis Orthia. He did not describe the famous spectacle that later writers would associate with Spartan youths, enduring lashes at the sanctuary, as though it had always existed in exactly the later form. Customs changed. What outsiders centuries afterward treated as timeless Sparta could belong to developments far removed from Theras' childhood. What mattered to him now was simpler. Sacred festivals gathered the community. Boys watched older boys. Younger performers learned from experienced choruses. Citizens, families, visitors, and workers encountered one another beneath rules of ritual older than any person present. "You must know the songs," Phrynon said. "Why?" Antalcidas asked. "To sing them." Antalcidas waited. Phryon's eyes brightened. Theras could tell the old man was enjoying himself. "And because someday," he continued, "a younger boy will stand where you stand. If none of you remember, what will you teach him?" That silenced Antalcidas. Theras considered this. Until now, almost every lesson had been about receiving something: instructions, food, discipline, knowledge. He had not considered that learning created an obligation to pass things onward. The thought remained with him when they left the sanctuary. Doron did not take them home by the direct route. Instead, he turned toward a busier part of the settlement, where craftsmen and traders moved through the day's work. The sounds changed: hammering, sawing, animals shifting beneath loads, pottery touching pottery with hollow clinks. A perioikos metalworker was waiting for them near an open-sided workshop. His name was Theocles. His arms were marked with old burns, none serious enough to attract attention from adults but fascinating to the boys. Behind him stood a furnace. Theras immediately moved closer. Doron stopped him with one hand. "Not there." Theras stepped back. Heat breathed from the work area. Theocles showed them a finished spearhead. "You have seen one." Several boys nodded. "Have you seen one before it becomes this?" They had not. He showed them pieces of iron and tools used in working metal. The boys leaned forward. Aegison's spear appeared in Theras' memory. The weight of the shaft across his small hands, the protected point at its end. He had thought of the weapon as one object. Now it separated into materials and tasks. Wood had to be selected for the shaft. Iron had to be worked. A socket had to fit properly. Balance mattered. Someone had to make each part before a citizen could carry the finished spear. Theocles heated a small piece of metal while keeping the boys safely back. When it was ready, he placed it against the anvil and struck. The sound rang through the workshop. Theras felt it in his chest. Again. The hammer descended with controlled force. Again. Sparks moved briefly through the dimmer air beneath the roof. Theocles stopped. "You like the sparks," he said. The boys smiled. "Everyone likes the sparks." He placed the hammer down. "The sparks are not the work." Doron glanced at them. Theras knew another lesson was coming. "The work," Theocles continued, "is knowing when the metal is ready, where to strike, how hard, and when to stop." He held up the unfinished piece. "A fool can make sparks." Antalcidas nodded solemnly. Theras suspected he was imagining himself making excellent sparks. They watched other tasks in the workshop. Bronze fittings waited in a basket. Tongs rested near charcoal. A younger assistant turned and checked tools while Theocles worked. The perioikoi occupied a necessary position within the Spartan state. Free but outside the full Spartiate citizen body, their communities participated in trade and manufacturing and supplied skilled work the citizen ideal discouraged Spartiates from pursuing as occupations. Theras understood this not as political structure but as a discovery. The spear his father carried depended upon men his father did not train beside. The lesson resembled Doron's pebble falling into the Eurotas. Dependence again. Near midday, the boys ate in the shade beside the workshop. Their meal was modest, but Theocles sent over a small bowl of olives. Theras took one. He remembered the cakes. Without being instructed, he passed the bowl. By the time it reached Echecratidas, only 2 remained. Echecratidas looked into the bowl, then at the boys who had not yet received one. He sighed with great seriousness and took only one. Antalcidas stared. "You are changing." "I know." Echecratidas sounded worried. Theras laughed. On the return journey, they passed Eurotas. He was guiding a donkey carrying 2 baskets. This time, Theras did not merely nod. "Eurotas." The man stopped. His expression warmed. "Theras." The other boys continued several paces before Doron halted them. Theras suddenly worried that he had broken formation, though none had been required. Eurotas adjusted one basket. "How are the feet?" Theras smiled. "Still there." "Useful." Theras looked toward the load. "Where are you going?" "To your house." "What is that?" "Onions." Theras glanced at the baskets. There were many onions. "Timareta hates onions." "I know." They both smiled. Then Eurytas continued on his way. Doron said nothing when Theras rejoined the group. That silence felt like permission. By late afternoon, they were back at the training ground. Phryon's song remained in Theras's head. So did the ringing of Theoclus's hammer. One sound preserved memory, the other shaped metal. That evening, as the boys prepared their reed beds, Menesarchos sat beside Theras. He removed the little clay horse. "My brother made offerings once," he said. Theras looked at him. "For Artemis?" Menesarchos nodded. "He made small animals." "Was he good?" "Yes." A quiet pride entered the answer. Theras examined the scratched horse again. Perhaps Damis would never stand among them in training. But something he knew had already reached them through Menesarchos's knots. Something his hands made could enter a sanctuary. His place in Sparta was different, not absent. Theras returned the disc. Menesarchos closed his fingers around it. From outside came the soft beginning of a song from an older group. Theras recognized the rhythm. Without thinking, he tapped it against his knee. Menesarchos joined him. Across the sleeping space, Antalcidas joined badly. Then Echecratidas. Soon half the boys were tapping the pattern. Agesippos appeared in the doorway. Every hand stopped. He looked around. "Sleep." They obeyed. But Theras carried the rhythm with him into the darkness, along with a new understanding that Sparta was being made around him every day. Not only by boys learning discipline or men carrying shields, but by singers remembering old words, farmers lifting baskets, craftsmen judging heated iron, mothers counting stores, and people whose names might never enter a poet's song. Tomorrow, Doron would ask them to begin learning something that would seem, at first, much simpler than any of these things. How to dance. Doron's idea of dancing began with standing still. Theras should have expected this. The boys assembled after breakfast in an open space where the ground had been swept smooth. Phrynon waited beneath the shade with his lyre, and beside him stood a woman Theras did not know. She was perhaps the age of his mother, with her hair braided and fastened behind her head. Her dress was plain, and she wore no ornaments except a narrow bronze pin at one shoulder. Antalcidas leaned toward Theras. "Perhaps she will teach us." The woman heard him. "Yes." Antalcidas straightened. Her name was Gorgo. Several boys exchanged glances because it was also a name used by women of distinguished families, and would later become particularly famous in Sparta. This Gorgo, however, belonged to no royal household. She had spent years helping prepare choruses for religious festivals. She walked before the line. "Show me how you stand when you sing." The boys arranged themselves. She inspected them. Then she pointed at Brasidas. "Your shoulders are trying to reach your ears." Brasidas lowered them. At Echecratidas she stopped. "You are leaning." "I am not." "You are." Echecratidas corrected himself. Then she reached Theras. "Your left foot is forward." Theras looked down. It was. "Does it matter?" Gorgo raised an eyebrow. Theras immediately suspected he had made Antalcidas's mistake of asking a question whose answer was already approaching. "You tell me," she said. Theras looked at the other boys. Their feet were nearly aligned. If everyone moves together, yes. Good. She continued down the line. Phrynon plucked several quiet notes. The lesson began. At first they did nothing more complicated than shift their weight from one foot to the other in time with the lyre. Left, right, left, right. Theras could do it. Taygetus could do it. Even Echecratidas could do it. Then Gorgo added a step forward. The line dissolved. A boy collided with Cleon. Brasidas moved too early. Taygetus stepped backward. Gorgo stopped them. Again. By the fifth attempt, they could move forward together. Then came a turn. Disaster returned. Theras discovered that 20 boys could produce astonishing confusion using only 2 feet each. Gorgo remained patient. She did not carry Doron's staff, but Theras soon decided she did not need one. "You do not dance by chasing the person beside you," she said. "You know the measure, and you keep it." Phrynon repeated the rhythm. Theras listened. 4 measured beats. Turn. 2 steps. Pause. The movement began to settle into his body. The training was unlike wrestling, where another boy resisted him, or running, where he could measure himself against distance. Here, success existed only if the group succeeded. When Theras performed his own steps correctly, but Taygetus turned late, the line still bent. When Brasidas rushed, everyone around him had to correct. When Echecratidas forgot a pause, he nearly walked directly into Gorgo. She put one hand on his shoulder. "Where were you going?" Echecratidas looked around. "I don't know." Then arrived there later. Even Doron smiled. They practiced until the sun climbed. The dance was related to movements boys might perform in choruses at public festivals. Sparta was famous among other Greeks not only for military discipline but also for organized choral performance, where age groups could appear in songs and dances that linked generations. In such performances, the body became part of memory. The same boys who learned to keep a line while exercising learned to keep time in song. The same attention to companions mattered in both. Yet the purpose of dance was not merely preparation for war. There was pleasure in it. Theras realized this when Phrynon changed the melody. The new tune moved more quickly. Gorgo demonstrated a sequence herself. She stepped lightly, turned, and brought one foot down exactly with the strongest note from the lyre. For the first time that morning, the boys forgot to think about whether they were being disciplined. They simply wanted to imitate her. Theras tried. His turn was too large. He corrected it, again. On the next attempt, he found the rhythm. A strange feeling passed through him when the entire line moved together. The earth sounded beneath their feet, not loudly, just one soft, unified beat. Gorgo let the sequence continue longer than before. When she finally raised her hand, several boys were smiling. Taygetus whispered, "I am excellent." "You went the wrong way twice," Theras said. "Excellent eventually." Before the midday meal, Gorgo divided them into smaller groups. Theras, Mnesarchos, Cleon, Brasidas, and Echecratidas practiced together. Taygetus was placed elsewhere. Theras immediately noticed that he missed him. Without Taygetus's whispers, the work became strangely quiet. Mnesarchos moved well. His balance was nearly as good in dancing as in their earlier exercises. "You have done this before," Theras said during a pause. "My mother taught songs." "Your brother, too?" Mnesarchos nodded. "Damas danced better." Theras noticed he no longer hesitated before speaking his brother's name. What happened to him? The question escaped before Theras could stop it. Mnesarchos looked toward Gorgo. For several moments he said nothing. Then, quietly, "His leg." Theras waited. "He was injured when he was little. A cartwheel." There was no dramatic story in the words, no battle, no divine judgment, only an accident. Damas could walk, Mnesarchos explained, but not well enough to enter the same demanding path expected of citizen boys. Theras thought of the clay horse. He makes things instead. Yes. Does he like it? Menasarkos considered. Sometimes. That answer seemed more truthful than yes or no. Gorgo called them back into position. They resumed. Later, over bread and cheese, Theras found himself thinking about Damas. Spartan ideals praised strength, endurance, and physical capability, but real communities contained bodies that did not fit ideals neatly. Injury, illness, age, poverty, family circumstance, and fortune complicated every system people tried to make orderly. Theras had assumed that a boy absent from their group belonged somewhere entirely different. Now he imagined Damas sitting at a workbench, scratching horses into clay. The thought did not make the distinctions of Spartan society disappear. It made them more human. After the meal, Doron led the boys toward the edge of the training ground, where several shields rested against a wall. They were smaller practice shields, not the full heavy equipment used by adult hoplites. Every boy stared. Antalcidas forgot to speak. Doron lifted one. Yesterday, you heard that a shield is not only yours. Theras immediately looked at him. Doron slipped his arm into the central band and gripped the handle closer to the rim. The round shield used by a hoplite sits partly to your left. He demonstrated. This leaves part of your body relying upon the man beside you. The boys had already heard the principle. Seeing it was different. Doron called Agesippos forward. The older youth took another shield and stood beside him. The two overlapped naturally. Theras understood at once. It was the dance, not literally. But the problem was the same. Position mattered. Distance mattered. A person moving too far from his companion did not merely make himself untidy. He created a gap. Doron gave several boys the practice shields. Theras had to wait. When his turn came, he took the wooden shield with both hands. It was lighter than an adult shield, but still awkward. He worked his left arm through the band. The weight settled against him. Beside Menasarkos, Doron said. Theras moved into place. Menasarkos held another shield. Their edges overlapped. Walk. They stepped forward. Theras immediately stared at the shield. Eyes up, said Doron. Theras obeyed. They moved again. He had to feel where Menasarkos was rather than constantly look at him. One step, another. The shield bumped Menasarkos's. Theras corrected. Soon the line of boys holding the practice equipment advanced slowly across the ground. No spears, no armor, no martial shouting. Only children discovering how difficult it was to walk while carrying a large object and remaining close to another person. Theras's arm began to ache. Doron made them stop. Again tomorrow. Antalcidas groaned. Doron looked at him. Did you believe shields became lighter because you disliked them? No? Good. That evening, Gorgo returned for a final rehearsal. The sun was lowering, and the heat had left the open ground. Phrynon played. The boys began the sequence they had learned that morning. Left, right, forward, turn, pause. Theras listened to the feet around him. For several moments, nobody rushed. Nobody collided. The line curved exactly where Gorgo had shown them. Then the boys returned to their places on the final beat. Silence followed. Gorgo nodded. It was the same small gesture Agassiz used when words were unnecessary. Theras felt proud, not of his own steps, of the line. Later, lying on the reeds, he could still feel the practice shield against his arm. Menasarkos was beside him. Does Damas still dance? Theras whispered. Sometimes at home. With his bad leg? Yes. How? Menasarkos was quiet for a moment. Differently. Theras stared into the darkness. That single word remained with him longer than he expected. Outside, Sparta had become still beneath the warm night. Somewhere a lyre sounded faintly from another household or gathering. Theras listened until he could no longer distinguish the melody. Then he imagined Damas moving carefully to music, not as the city had expected him to move, but as he could. And before sleep came, Theras began to wonder how many different kinds of strength Sparta contained that no training ground knew how to measure. The question about strength remained with Theras until the next afternoon. When Doron took the boys somewhere, strength seemed to matter very little. They were going to watch women race. The announcement produced silence. Then Antalcidas asked, "Why?" Doron looked at him. Theras waited for the familiar consequence of an unnecessary question. Instead, Doron answered, "Because you live in Sparta." That explanation appeared to satisfy Doron completely. The boys followed him through the settlement toward an open exercise ground where girls and young women sometimes trained. Theras had passed such places before, but he had never watched closely. In his household, physical activity among women was ordinary enough that nobody presented it as remarkable. Lysandra walked long distances, supervised agricultural work, lifted storage vessels when necessary, and had once thrown a sandal across the courtyard with frightening accuracy when a dog tried to steal drying meat. Yet organized exercise was different. Several girls were already running when the boys arrived. Their garments allowed freer movement than the long enclosed clothing associated with respectable women in some other Greek communities. Spartan customs regarding female dress and exercise attracted comment from outsiders, especially Athenians, whose expectations for elite women could be very different. Theras knew nothing of Athenian opinions. He recognized one of the runners, his cousin Agesistrata. She was 13 and considerably taller than he was. She saw him watching. Her expression became mischievous. Theras immediately wished she had not seen him. A woman supervising the runners called them into position. They began. Agesistrata ran with long, steady strides. Another girl moved ahead early, but Agesistrata did not chase her immediately. She kept her pace, then increased it near the final stretch. She finished second. Theras was impressed. Antalcidas leaned toward him. "She is fast." "I know. Faster than you." Theras frowned. "She is 13. So? So I am 7. Antalcidas considered. "She is still faster." Theras could find no weakness in this argument. Doron gathered the boys closer. "Why do they train?" Cleon raised his hand. "For festivals?" "Yes. What else?" No one answered. Doron looked toward the runners. In Sparta, strength is expected in more than one place. Girls and women were encouraged to exercise, run, dance, and compete in ways that appeared unusual to some other Greeks. Ancient writers often explained the practice through the Spartan belief that physically healthy women would bear healthy children, though that explanation reflected the strongly communal and reproductive ideals of Spartan citizen society. But exercise also belonged to public life. Girls participated in choruses and festivals. Women managed households and property. Their voices could carry considerable influence within families and, indirectly, within the wider community. The realities were more complicated than later admiration sometimes suggested. Spartan women did not possess political citizenship equal to men. Their lives were shaped by expectations of marriage, household continuity, property, fertility, religion, and social status. Yet, compared with women in many other Greek cities, elite Spartan women could occupy unusually visible and economically significant positions. Theras saw only his cousin wiping sweat from her forehead. Agesistrata came over when the race ended. "You are watching us?" "Doron made us." "That sounds like something Doron would do." Theras stared. "You know Doron too?" She laughed. "Everyone knows Doron." Theras was beginning to suspect that every adult in Sparta had existed in some mysterious network before his birth. Agesistrata looked at Antalcidas. "Race me." Antalcidas stepped backward. "No." Theras laughed. Agesistrata pointed at him. "You." Theras stopped laughing. Doron said nothing, which meant somehow that the race was going to happen. They stood at a line scratched into the earth. The distance was short. Theras bent forward. Agesistrata remained almost casually upright. Someone called the start. Theras ran. For perhaps 4 strides, he thought he was doing well. Then Agesistrata passed him. She reached the end several paces ahead and turned. Theras arrived, breathing hard. "You are slow," she said. "You are older." "Yes." This was, apparently, no defense. Agesistrata handed him a cup of water. "You watched my feet when you should have watched where you were going." Theras drank. That sounded unpleasantly like Doron. He looked back toward the boys. Antalcidas was laughing so hard he had bent over. Theras made a quiet decision to remember this when wrestling practice returned. The visit ended not with racing, but with song. A group of girls gathered beneath shade and rehearsed a choral passage for an approaching festival. Phrynon was not directing them. Their instructor was an older woman named Lampito, whose voice was deep and clear. The boys listened. The melody differed from the one they had practiced. Several voices carried the higher line while others answered in measured phrases. The result seemed to move across the open ground like weaving. One strand, then another, crossing, returning. Theras thought of Lysandra's storeroom and the women who spun thread in the courtyard. Perhaps music could be woven too. When the song ended, Doron did not explain it. He simply led them away. They walked south toward a broad public space. More people appeared as they approached. Men stood in groups talking. Messengers moved between buildings. Older citizens passed with the deliberate pace of people who expected others to make room without being asked. Theras lowered his voice. "Where are we going now?" "To listen," Doron said. This was the first time the boys had been brought close to one of the places where adult Spartan civic life could be observed. Sparta was governed through institutions whose exact forms developed over time. 2 hereditary kings, a council of elders known as the Gerousia, annually selected ephors with important authority, and an assembly of male citizens. To a child, none of these arrangements seemed neat. The city had 2 kings. Theras had asked his father once why. Agason had replied, because one would be simpler. Theras had waited for the rest of the explanation. There had been none. Spartan tradition traced the dual kingship to 2 royal houses, the Agiads and Eurypontids, each claiming descent from Heracles through legendary ancestors. The kings held military and religious roles, yet they were not absolute rulers. Their power existed beside that of other institutions. Theras understood kings mostly as distant men, whose names appeared in prayers, public events, and adult conversations. Today, no king stood before him. Instead, several citizens were discussing a dispute involving grazing land and obligations between households. Doron positioned the boys far enough away not to interfere. "Listen," Theras tried. At first, adult civic discussion proved deeply disappointing. Nobody gave a magnificent speech. No one announced the fate of Sparta. 2 men disagreed about boundaries. An older man asked a question. Someone mentioned witnesses. Someone else referred to an agreement Theras did not understand. Antalcidas began examining an insect crawling across his wrist. Doron noticed. "Listen." Antalcidas listened. Theras forced himself to do the same. Gradually, he recognized something. The men did not all agree. That seemed obvious once noticed, yet it disturbed a simple image he had carried in his mind. Sparta trained people to move together, sing together, eat together, stand together. Theras had begun unconsciously to imagine that good Spartans would therefore think together. They did not. One man believed the boundary lay near a stand of olives. Another insisted an older marker had been moved. A third questioned both. Voices remained controlled, but disagreement was real. When the discussion ended, Doron led the boys into shade. "What did you hear?" "A field," said Echecratidas. "A disagreement," Cleon answered. Doron nodded. "Did the city break?" The boys looked at one another. No, Theras said. Why not? This was harder. Manasarkos spoke quietly. Because they talked. Doron glanced at him. Yes. He picked up a dry twig. Discipline is not everyone having one mind. He snapped the twig between his fingers. It is knowing what must hold when minds differ. Theras remembered the dance. A boy could dislike a step and still keep the measure. He remembered the shield line. One person could adjust without abandoning the man beside him. It seemed the lesson extended farther than the training ground. On their way back, the boys passed a small market activity near visiting traders. Sparta was not isolated from the wider Greek world. Goods and travelers moved through Laconia, especially through perioikoi communities and ports. Yet Spartan citizen culture cultivated suspicion toward excessive luxury and foreign habits, at least in ideal and regulation. Theras stopped briefly before a trader displaying small objects. There were colored beads, carved pieces, fine cloth, and a tiny perfume container painted more delicately than anything in his household. He stared at the vessel. It was beautiful. Taygetus stared too. How much? Doron's voice came from behind them. You have no money. Taygetus turned. I was asking for knowledge. Doron raised one eyebrow. Theras covered his mouth. The trader laughed. Spartan coinage itself would later become famous in stories about heavy iron money supposedly designed to discourage wealth and luxury, though the historical development was more complicated than the neat anecdotes preserved by later authors. For Theras, money was simply something adults handled. He wanted the painted vessel without knowing what he would do with it. Then he thought of Manasarkos's clay horse. That object was rough. Its lines were uneven. Yet Manasarkos carried it every day. Theras walked on. The evening meal tasted unusually good after the long afternoon. Echecratidas ate his bread, then stared mournfully at the empty space before him. You are changing less today, Taygetus told him. I was faster than yesterday. That is not the lesson. Echecratidas looked offended. Later, while the boys prepared for sleep, Doron entered carrying several lengths of cord. Manasarkos looked up immediately. Doron placed the cord on the floor. Tomorrow you will work in pairs. Taygetus whispered, knots. Theras smiled toward Manasarkos. For once, they possessed knowledge that had arrived before Doron's lesson. Manasarkos touched the little clay horse beneath his tunic. Then he looked across at Theras. Neither boy said anything. Outside, women's voices from a distant rehearsal floated through the darkness, rising and falling in measured answer. Theras lay upon his reeds and listened. Agesistratas running, citizens disagreeing over a field, girls singing together, a painted vessel from somewhere beyond Laconia, a knot taught by a brother who could not join the Agog. The city was becoming larger in his mind, not in size, in difference. And perhaps, Theras thought as sleep approached, Sparta's hardest task was not teaching people to be the same. It was teaching many unequal, separate, complicated lives to hold together long enough to call themselves one community. The cords Doron had brought were waiting on the ground when the boys assembled after breakfast. Each was roughly the length of Theras's arm. Beside them lay bundles of reeds, several straight sticks, and 2 empty baskets. Taygetus looked at the materials. We are building beds again. No, said Manasarkos. How do you know? Those reeds are green. Taygetus stared at him. Theras smiled. The lesson had already begun. Doron paired the boys and gave each pair a length of cord. Theras was placed with Brasidas. Manasarkos, to Theras's disappointment, went with Cleon. Tie the 2 sticks together, Doron said. Nothing more. Brasidas immediately crossed the sticks. Theras wrapped the cord around them. He tried the knot Manasarkos had taught him. The sticks slipped. Brasidas caught one before it struck his foot. You said you knew knots. I know one knot. That one? Apparently not for this. Across the yard, Menesarchos and Cleon were already tightening their binding. Theras watched their hands. Doron noticed. Do not copy yet. Theras looked away. Why? Because first I want you to discover what your mistake does. Doron lifted the joined sticks. He twisted them. Theras' knot loosened immediately. The cord holds, Doron said, until the sticks move. If they move, it fails. He returned them. Again. Brasidas held the sticks while Theras tried a different wrapping. This time he crossed the cord repeatedly around the joint before knotting it. They tested the binding. Better. Still loose. Brasidas frowned. We need to pull the sticks together before tying them. Theras looked at him. They tried. The joint tightened. When Doron returned, he twisted the sticks. The cord creaked but held. Better. Theras liked that word. It did not mean finished. It meant continue. By mid-morning, the boys had learned several simple bindings useful for carrying loads, securing bundles, repairing equipment, or fastening objects together. Menesarchos moved through the tasks easily. Doron eventually called him forward. Show them. Menesarchos froze. Theras saw the change immediately. His friend could tie almost anything Doron placed before him, but standing in front of 20 boys was another matter. Doron handed him 2 sticks. Menesarchos looked down. His fingers began. Around, cross, tighten. The knot formed neatly. How did you know that? Doron asked. My brother. Name? Damas. Doron nodded. Then today, Damas teaches us. Menesarchos looked up. For the first time since Theras had known him, the quiet boy appeared unsure what expression belonged on his face. Doron did not linger over it. He simply made the others repeat the binding. But Theras understood what had happened. A boy absent from the training ground had entered it through knowledge carried by his brother. No proclamation had been required. Damas was simply useful. Perhaps usefulness, Theras thought, was one of the quiet paths by which people entered the lives of others. After the knot work, Doron filled one basket with stones. The boys stared. Echecratitis sighed. Are we eating those? Antalcidas asked. Doron ignored him. He threaded a pole through the basket handles and showed how 2 boys could carry the load between them. Brasidas. Theras. They stepped forward. The basket was heavier than Theras expected. He took one end of the pole. Brasidas took the other. Across the ground, they began. Theras walked too quickly. The basket swung. Brasidas stumbled. Stop, Doron said. They stopped. What happened? He slowed, Theras said. Brasidas frowned. He rushed. Doron looked at Theras. Theras corrected himself. We did not match. Again. They started more carefully. The weight remained unpleasant, but the basket stopped swinging. At the far end of the ground they turned. Brasidas now set the pace. Theras followed. When they returned, Doron gave the task to another pair. Weight shared badly, he told the boys, can feel heavier than weight carried alone. Theras rubbed his shoulder. He would remember that. The principal followed them into the afternoon. Doron took the group beyond the main settlement, toward cultivated land where the late summer heat lay heavily over the valley. Dust rose beneath their feet. Cicadas sounded from the trees. Above everything, Taygetus stood blue-gray in the distance, its high ridges appearing cool from below even when the valley baked beneath the sun. The boys carried no practice shields. Instead, each pair had a small bundle. One contained cord, another carried drinking cups, another carried a cloth-wrapped meal. Theras and Brasidas carried 2 wooden pegs and a light tool. Antalcidas complained that Echecratidas had received the food. I am guarding it, Echecratidas said. That is why I am worried. Doron led them toward a cluster of agricultural buildings belonging to land associated with several citizen households. Workers were repairing a storage structure before the coming change in season. The roof was the problem, not the entire roof. One section of thatch and supporting material had sagged after wind and age loosened its bindings. Theras immediately understood why they had practiced knots. Eurotas was there. This time, Theras did not hesitate. Eurotas. Eurotas turned from a stack of cut material. Still have both feet? Yes. Remarkable. Theras smiled. Doron divided the boys among simple tasks that kept them safely on the ground. They carried reeds and bundles, sorted usable pieces from damaged ones, held cord, moved pegs, watched how adults repaired the roof frame. The work was not heroic. It smelled of dust, straw, sweat, old wood, and stored grain. Theras liked it. A helot worker named Callias showed him how to test a reed bundle by bending it gently. If it cracks here, no. He pointed near the base. If it bends too easily. Too young? Callias nodded. Theras sorted again. Nearby, Brasidas was learning to coil cord properly instead of allowing it to tangle around his ankles. No one called what they were doing training. Yet Doron watched everything. When Antalcidas carelessly dropped a useful length of binding into the dirt, Doron made him retrieve, clean, and rewind it. Nothing disappears because you stop looking at it, he said. Theras thought of the household stores. Lysandra would have approved. The roof repair revealed a Sparta unlike the stories boys sometimes told one another at night. Those stories concerned heroic ancestors, legendary kings, contests, marches, and men standing firm beneath shields. No one told stories about storage roofs, yet grain kept badly could spoil. Rain entering a building could ruin food. A broken binding ignored in summer might become a serious problem in winter. Theras began to understand that much of survival consisted of noticing small failures before they became large ones. Near midday, everyone rested. They ate beneath a fig tree. The food was bread, onions, cheese, and a few olives. Antalcidas held up his onion. Tiamareta would hate this. Theras laughed. He had told the boys enough stories about his sister that several of them now spoke of her as though they knew her. Echecratidas bit into his onion without complaint. Antalcidas stared. You eat everything. Yes. Would you eat a sandal? What kind? Theras nearly choked on his bread. Even Menesarchos laughed aloud. The workers resting nearby glanced over. For a few moments the divisions of Spartan society felt less visible. Everyone was tired. Everyone wanted shade. Everyone drank from cups filled from the same water vessel. But the divisions had not vanished. When the work resumed, Theras noticed that Doron gave instructions while Eurotas and the others did most of the skilled labor. The boys visited. The workers remained. At sunset, Theras would return to a citizen training system built around preparing him for privileges and obligations unavailable to the men teaching him how to judge reeds. The discomfort he had felt weeks earlier returned. He waited until Doron was alone. Why doesn't Eurotas train like father? Doron looked at him. Theras immediately realized how enormous the question was. Doron did not answer quickly. Because Eurotas is a helot. I know. Do you? Theras frowned. He knew the word. That was not what Doron meant. Doron looked toward the fields. Sparta conquered people in Laconia and Messenia. Their descendants work land from which citizens receive produce. That is part of how our way of life is supported. Theras followed his gaze. Did they choose it? No. The answer was plain. Theras was quiet. Children sometimes encountered injustice first, not as an argument, but as a fact that adults had already learned to live beside. Eurotas was kind to him. Eurotas worked land. Agison trained as a citizen because other people worked. All three things were true at once. Is it fair? Theras asked. Doron's eyes remained on the fields. That is a larger question than your age makes easy. Theras waited. Doron finally looked down at him. But do not make the smaller mistake of pretending you owe nothing to people because the law gives you more than it gives them. Then he called the boys back to work. Theras carried that answer more heavily than the basket of stones. Late in the afternoon, the repaired section of roof was finished. Eurotas climbed down from the low ladder and tested the last binding. It held. Menasarkos examined it from below. "My brother uses that knot." Eurotas smiled. "Then your brother has sense." Menasarkos stood a little straighter. The boys gathered their materials. Before leaving, Theras looked back at the storage building. Nothing about it appeared grand. No traveler would cross mountains to admire the knot beneath its roof. No poet would praise the reed bundle Brasidas had carried. Yet the repair mattered. The stored grain mattered. The people doing the work mattered. On the return journey, Doron did not speak. The boys were tired enough to keep their own silence. Their shadows lengthened ahead of them. Theras walked beside Menasarkos. Damas taught the group today. Menasarkos nodded. He would like that. "Tell him." "I will." They continued. After several steps, Menasarkos added, "He might pretend he does not." Theras smiled. "Tell him anyway." That night, Agesipos's inspection found every cord properly coiled and every sleeping place orderly. Theras lay down on his reeds. His thoughts returned to Doron's answer beside the fields. Sparta was teaching him to carry weight with another person. It was also teaching him, though perhaps less deliberately, to notice who had been carrying weight long before he arrived. Beyond the sleeping space, the valley was quiet. Harvest stores waited beneath repaired roofs. Household lamps burned low. Workers rested before another morning. And somewhere in the city, Damas might soon hear that a knot learned from his hands had been taught to 20 Spartan boys. For Theras, that seemed worth remembering. Damas did hear. 3 mornings later, Menasarkos arrived at the training ground carrying no clay horse. Theras noticed immediately. He had become accustomed to seeing Menasarkos touch the small disc beneath his tunic whenever he was uncertain, as though the scratched animal were less an object than a private doorway back into his household. "Where is it?" Theras asked. "My brother has it." "Why?" Menasarkos looked almost pleased. "He said if he is teaching Spartan boys now, he should be paid." Theras blinked. "With his own horse?" "He says it was never mine." "Was it?" Menasarkos considered. "I don't know." Antalcidas appeared beside them. "What are you talking about?" "Nothing," said Menasarkos. Antalcidas looked wounded. "That has never stopped me before." Doron called them into line. The morning began with running, not racing. Doron led them beyond the familiar exercise ground and along a route following the lower land near the river. The boys had run short distances many times, but today they were expected to maintain an even pace together. This proved much harder. Brasidas wanted to go faster. Echecratidas began strongly and then slowed. Antalcidas attempted conversation for the first few hundred paces, and discovered that speech consumed breath he would shortly need for other purposes. Theras settled between Menasarkos and Cleon. At first the rhythm felt easy. Then his breathing deepened. Dust clung to his damp legs. The line stretched. "Close it," Doron called. The faster boys shortened their stride. The slower ones worked harder. Nobody stopped. They passed olive groves and patches of cultivated land where workers looked up briefly as the group went by. A shepherd stood on a slope beyond them with goats scattered among low vegetation. Theras began counting steps. 10, 20, 30. Then he lost count and began again. Eventually, the discomfort became strangely ordinary. His legs were tired. That did not mean they had ceased working. His lungs wanted more air. They received it. The world narrowed to pace, ground, breath, and the boy beside him. Doron finally raised his hand. They slowed to a walk. Antalcidas bent forward. I have died. You are speaking, said Cleon. I am speaking after death. Doron passed them. The dead are usually quieter. Antalcidas straightened. They drank at the river. Theras sat on a smooth stone and let his feet cool in the shallow water. Doron remained standing. You ran farther because nobody tried to win. Brasidas looked toward him. We could have gone faster. You could. Brasidas waited. Doron pointed back along the route. Would all of you have arrived? Brasidas said nothing. The question was simple enough. Theras understood that this was another form of the basket carried by two boys. A group could waste strength by mistaking speed for success. They returned walking. The afternoon brought a different kind of preparation. The festival Gorgo had mentioned was approaching, and the younger boys would take a modest place among the public performances and processions. They were not the center of anything. Older choruses knew more complicated songs. Experienced dancers occupied more visible positions. For Theras, this made no difference. It would be his first public appearance as part of the boys' group rather than beside his family. Gorgo inspected them after the midday rest. Again, Phrynon played. They moved. The sequence that had once caused collisions now seemed almost comfortable. Theras no longer had to think about each turn. His body recognized the measure. Gorgo stopped them midway. Too comfortable? The boys stared. Antalcidas whispered, That is unfair. Gorgo heard. Comfort makes you stop listening. She changed their positions. Theras was moved from beside Menisarchos and placed next to Brasidas. Antalcidas went to the far end. Again. Suddenly, the dance felt unfamiliar. Brasidas took smaller steps than Menisarchos during turns. The boy on Theras's other side breathed heavily enough for him to hear it. The spacing changed. Theras almost moved too far. He corrected. Gorgo nodded. That is why you learn the measure, instead of memorizing your neighbor. They repeated the sequence until the new arrangement felt natural. Then she changed it again. By sunset, Theras understood the cruelty hidden inside a competent teacher's imagination. That night, he slept deeply. The next day was given partly to festival preparation throughout the settlement. The city sounded different. Not louder everywhere, but busier in small pockets. Garlands were being prepared. Households cleaned clothing intended for public use. Animals and provisions moved toward places where communal meals and sacrifices would be arranged. People rehearsed songs in courtyards. Theras and the boys helped carry bundles of branches from one place to another under Agesipos's supervision. They passed a group of girls rehearsing. Agesistrata was among them. She saw Theras and called, Still slow? Theras continued walking. Antalcidas immediately answered for him. Very. Theras nearly dropped his bundle trying to kick Antalcidas's ankle without Agesipos noticing. Agesipos noticed. He said nothing. His silence was worse. Later, they were allowed time with their households. Theras returned home to find the courtyard transformed by preparations. Lysandra and two women were examining woven cloth. Timareta stood on a stool while Myrto tried to fasten a garment around her. I hate this, Timareta announced. You hate standing still, Myrto corrected. I also hate this. Theras entered. Timareta twisted around. Theras, tell her. Tell her what? That I am finished. Myrto looked at him. Theras considered the authority available to him. You are not finished. Timareta stared at him in betrayal. Myrto laughed. Lysandra handed Theras a folded tunic. For tomorrow. He touched the cloth. It was cleaner and finer than his ordinary training garment, though still restrained compared with richer clothing worn in other Greek communities. Do I have to wear it all day? No. Good. Lysandra examined him. You have grown. You said I would. I am pleased that you occasionally listen. Theras changed the subject. Will father be there? Yes. At the songs? If his duties allow. Aegison had been occupied for several days with preparations involving his mess companions and other citizens. Festivals required more than performers. Sacrificial arrangements, food contributions, processions, religious duties, visiting relatives, and public order all created work. Theras looked toward the doorway. I haven't seen him much. You are beginning to understand his life. Lysandra folded another garment. He has not seen you much either. Theras had not considered that. Aegison returned near dusk. He found Theras helping Eurotas move a jar from one shaded part of the courtyard to another. Not with your back, Eurotas said. Theras adjusted. Aegison watched. When the jar was settled, Theras straightened. His father nodded toward Eurotas. You teach him well, when he listens. That is the difficult part. Theras frowned at both men. Aegison washed and sat beneath the courtyard shelter. Theras joined him. For some time, neither spoke. Timareta ran past, carrying flowers she had apparently been told not to scatter. Lysandra called after her. Theras smiled. Were you afraid before your first festival with the boys? Aegison looked at him. No. Theras waited. His father's expression shifted. Yes. Theras was startled enough to laugh. You changed your answer. I remembered. What were you afraid of? Forgetting the song. Did you? No. Then why were you afraid? Aegison rested his hands on his knees. Knowing afterward that fear was unnecessary does not remove it beforehand. Theras looked across the courtyard. It was one of the longest answers his father had ever given him. What should I do if I forget? Listen. Theras smiled. Everyone told him the same thing. Perhaps Sparta had only one lesson and an astonishing number of ways to teach it. Before he left to rejoin the boys, Lysandra gave him a small piece of bread spread with honey. He looked at it. Do I have to share this? No. He ate it immediately before anyone could reconsider. The following morning arrived clear and still. Theras woke before Agesippos tapped the uprights. For once, the sleeping space remained quiet around him. He lay on his reeds and watched the darkness soften. One by one, the other boys began to stir. Nobody complained. Even Antalcidas rose without pretending to be dead. They washed carefully. Their festival garments had been brought. Phrynon arrived before sunrise. Gorgo came shortly afterward. She inspected the line and adjusted one fastening on Echecratides's shoulder. Then she stepped back. Remember the measure. Doron said nothing. He did not need to. The boys walked together toward the gathering place. As they entered the wider public space, Theras saw more people than he had expected. Families, citizens, women in festival clothing, children, older men, workers moving around the edges of the preparations, visitors from nearby communities. The smell of crushed greenery mixed with smoke beginning to rise from sacred fires. Music sounded somewhere ahead. Theras searched the crowd. He found Timareta first because she was waving both arms. Lysandra pulled one of them down. Beside her stood Aegison in his red cloak. Theras looked forward again before Gorgo could correct him. His stomach felt hollow. The song he knew perfectly had suddenly become difficult to remember. Then Menasarkos, standing 2 places away, began tapping the opening rhythm softly against his thigh. 4 measured beats. Pause. Again. Theras heard it. So did Antalcidas. So did the boys around them. No one spoke. Phrynon lifted the lyre. And as the first notes entered the morning air, Theras understood that remembering did not always mean holding everything alone. Phryon's first note was almost lost beneath the noises of the gathering. A child coughed. Someone farther back moved a wooden stool across the ground. A goat complained from somewhere near the animals being prepared for sacrifice. Then the second note sounded. Theras heard Menasarkos's fingers tapping against his thigh. 4 measured beats. Pause. The boys began. At first, Theras could hear only his own voice. It seemed much too loud. His mouth felt dry. He knew the words, yet each one appeared in his mind only an instant before he needed to sing it. Then Antalcidas entered beside the others. Cleon's voice joined. Brasidas, Echecratidas, Menasarchos. The individual voices became less important. Theras stopped wondering whether Agason was watching. He stopped imagining Timareta waving. He listened. The melody carried him. When the first movement began, the boys stepped forward together. Left, right, turn. The festival ground seemed enormous compared with their quiet practice space. There were too many faces, too many colors, too many small distractions at the edge of sight. Gorgo had been right. Comfort had made them memorize familiar neighbors. Now the crowd threatened to pull their attention outward. Theras kept the measure. Brasidas was beside him, not Menasarchos. Brasidas took the shorter turning step Theras had learned to expect. Theras adjusted without looking. Their feet came down together. A soft beat rose from the ground. Then another. The line curved. For several breaths the boys moved as one shape. Theras felt something settle inside him. This, he realized, was why Gorgo had changed their places. A formation that depended upon one familiar neighbor was not truly learned. A song that existed only when Phrynon reminded them of each phrase was not truly remembered. They reached the final passage. The voices rose, then ended. No dramatic cheering followed. This was a sacred festival, not a tavern contest. But people smiled. Families shifted. A few older boys nodded toward them. Phrynon lowered the lyre. Gorgo gave the smallest possible sign of approval. Theras immediately searched the crowd. Timareta was clapping far too enthusiastically. Lysandra permitted it this time. Agason stood beside her. He lifted his chin. Theras returned the gesture. The same exchange had passed between them on Theras's first evening away from home. Now it felt different. Then the younger group moved aside, because the festival belonged to more people than themselves. Older choruses followed. Theras watched girls perform a song whose answering lines he had heard in rehearsal. Agesistrata stood among them, serious now, no longer the cousin who mocked his running. Their movements were precise. Theras noticed details he would have ignored before Gorgo's lessons. The spacing between dancers, the way one line responded to another, the pause held without anyone moving early. He understood how difficult stillness could be. When Agesistrata's chorus finished, she passed the younger boys. Theras expected some comment. She merely whispered, "You did not forget." Neither had she. The religious observances continued. Smoke rose from sacrifice, carrying the smell of burning fat and wood into the clear air. Portions would be distributed according to custom, while offerings honored the gods whose presence Spartans understood as woven into the life of their community. For Theras, religion had always been physical. Water poured over hands, garlands, smoke, songs, the careful handling of sacred objects, silence at particular moments, adults who behaved differently inside a sanctuary than they did in a courtyard. He had never needed someone to explain the difference between sacred and ordinary time. People showed him with their bodies. At one point, a procession formed. The boys walked together again, this time without dancing. They passed men from the citizen body and families gathered near the route. Theras recognized craftsmen, helots attached to households, perioikoi who had come into Sparta for the occasion, and visitors from nearby settlements. The distinctions between them remained. A festival did not erase hierarchy, but it placed many of those lives within the same landscape of sound and ritual. Theras saw Eurotas near the edge of the gathering. Beside him stood Myrto. Theras smiled. Eurotas lifted one hand. Theras returned the greeting. Then, just behind them, he noticed a boy leaning slightly on a wooden staff. Menasarchos noticed, too. His step changed, only slightly. Theras followed his gaze. The boy was older than Menisarchos, perhaps 10 or 11. One leg turned differently as he stood. Beside him was a small table holding several clay objects: horses, birds, a dog, small human figures. Damas. Theras knew before anyone spoke. Menisarchos looked forward again. He kept the measure, but his face had changed. After the procession, the boys were allowed a period with their families before the communal activities continued. Menisarchos disappeared almost immediately. Theras found Lysandra first. Timareta collided with him. "You were good. Thank you." "I could hear Antalcidas." Theras glanced toward his friend. Antalcidas was several paces away, eating something. "You could hear all of us." "No, I could hear him." Theras decided not to tell Antalcidas. Lysandra placed both hands briefly on Theras's shoulders. "You listened." He smiled. Agassiz stood nearby. "How was the turn?" Theras asked. "What turn?" "The second one." "I watched the whole group." Theras felt slightly disappointed. Then he understood. His father had answered correctly. Agassiz had not watched Theras alone. That was the point. They ate a small portion of festival food together. The meat had been divided carefully. Bread accompanied it, along with onions and figs. Wine for adults was mixed with water, as Greek custom generally expected, while children drank water. Timareta objected to the onion. Theras immediately looked at Myrto. Myrto looked back. Neither needed to speak. After eating, Theras asked permission to find Menisarchos. He located him beside the table of clay figures. Damas was sitting now. The staff rested against his knee. Up close, Theras could see the resemblance between the brothers around the eyes. Menisarchos pointed toward him. "This is Theras." Damas examined him. "The knot thief." Theras stopped. Menisarchos laughed. "I told him. I did not steal it. You learned it without payment." Theras looked at the table. "Can I pay with one of your horses?" Damas stared at him. Then he laughed. Theras liked him immediately. The clay horse Menisarchos had once carried sat near Damas's hand. It looked even rougher beside the newer figures. Theras picked up a small bird. The wings had been marked with lines using a pointed tool before the clay hardened. "You made this?" "Yes." "For offerings?" "Some. Others people buy." Theras turned it carefully. Damas's hands were dusty with clay. His fingers were strong. "You taught Menisarchos the binding. He forgets half of what I teach him." "I do not," Menisarchos said. "You forgot how to repair the fishing net." "That was once." "Twice." Theras smiled. Damas shifted his leg. The movement seemed uncomfortable but practiced. "You boys used the knot?" "We repaired a roof." Damas nodded. "Good." There was no bitterness in the word, but Theras remembered Menisarchos saying that sometimes Damas liked his different life, and sometimes he did not. Theras looked at the clay figures. "Do you wish you were with us?" Menisarchos went still. Theras immediately wished he could pull the question back. Damas did not answer at once. Festival music sounded from farther away. Someone nearby laughed. A breeze moved through the leaves above them. "Sometimes," Damas said. Theras waited. "Sometimes I see you running and think I should be there." He picked up the clay horse. "Sometimes I see you running and am very pleased I am not." Menisarchos smiled. Damas continued. "The city had one path ready for me. My leg did not." He set the horse down. "That does not mean there was no other ground." Theras thought of the morning Doron had made them walk across stones. "Look where you place your feet. Not only there." He understood the sentence differently now. A woman approached the table and examined one of Damas's small figures. Damas immediately turned toward her. "That one is a deer. It looks like a goat." "It is a deer," she smiled. "How much?" Damas began bargaining. Menisarchos pulled Theras away before they interfered. They walked back toward the boys. You asked him, Menasarkos said. I should not have. He does not mind. Theras looked back. How do you know? He tells people when he minds. That sounded useful. The afternoon festival continued with competitions, songs, and communal gatherings. Theras watched older youths demonstrate exercises that seemed impossibly difficult. He watched men greet comrades from their common messes. He watched women move between family groups, organizing food and children with an efficiency that made official mail arrangements seem slow. Most of all, he watched people. Doron had told them to learn to see dependence. Theras was beginning to see something related. Sparta did not consist only of the citizens whose discipline would make its name famous. The citizen system stood at the center of power, certainly, supported by conquered labor and surrounded by free communities with fewer political privileges. But daily life spread far beyond the ideal image of the warrior. Someone shaped clay. Someone ground barley. Someone repaired roofs. Someone remembered songs. Someone trained choruses. Someone cultivated olives. Someone raised children who would enter different places in the same unequal world. Near evening, the younger boys assembled again. They were tired. Their fine garments had lost much of the morning's neatness. Echecratidas had a stain on one shoulder. Antalcidas had somehow acquired 2 figs and refused to explain where the second had come from. Doron inspected them. You performed well. 20 boys stood straighter. Then he added, Tomorrow you return to work. Antalcidas sighed. Theras smiled. That sounded right. The festival had given him 1 day of music, family, sacred smoke, and public pride. But Sparta was not built from festival days alone. It was built in what happened afterward, when people folded the fine garments away, when the songs ended, when workers returned to fields, when boys woke before sunrise. As twilight settled over the valley, Theras walked back with his group. He no longer felt the nervous emptiness that had filled his stomach before the song. Instead, he carried a different memory. Damas sitting beside his clay animals. The city had prepared one path. His leg had not followed it. Still, he had found other ground. Theras looked at the boys walking around him. Their own paths seemed fixed from where they stood. But for the first time, he wondered how much could change before any of them became the men Sparta expected. Phryon's first note was almost lost beneath the noises of the gathering. A child coughed. Someone farther back moved a wooden stool across the ground. A goat complained from somewhere near the animals being prepared for sacrifice. Then the second note sounded. Theras heard Nasarkos's fingers tapping against his thigh, 4 measured beats. Pause. The boys began. At first, Theras could hear only his own voice. It seemed much too loud. His mouth felt dry. He knew the words, yet each one appeared in his mind only an instant before he needed to sing it. Then Antalcidas entered beside the others. Cleon's voice joined. Brasidas, Echecratidas, Menasarkos. The individual voices became less important. Theras stopped wondering whether Aegisthun was watching. He stopped imagining Timareta waving. He listened. The melody carried him. When the first movement began, the boys stepped forward together. Left, right, turn. The festival ground seemed enormous compared with their quiet practice space. There were too many faces, too many colors, too many small distractions at the edge of sight. Gorgo had been right. Comfort had made them memorize familiar neighbors. Now the crowd threatened to pull their attention outward. Theras kept the measure. Brasidas was beside him. Not Menasarkos. Brasidas took the shorter turning step Theras had learned to expect. Theras adjusted without looking. Their feet came down together. A soft beat rose from the ground. Then another. The line curved. For several breaths, the boys moved as one shape. Theras felt something settle inside him. This, he realized, was why Gorgo had changed their places. A formation that depended upon one familiar neighbor was not truly learned. A song that existed only when Phrynon reminded them of each phrase was not truly remembered. They reached the final passage. The voices rose, then ended. No dramatic cheering followed. This was a sacred festival, not a tavern contest. But people smiled. Families shifted. A few older boys nodded toward them. Phrynon lowered the lyre. Gorgo gave the smallest possible sign of approval. Theras immediately searched the crowd. Timoreta was clapping far too enthusiastically. Lysandra permitted it this time. Agason stood beside her. He lifted his chin. Theras returned the gesture. The same exchange had passed between them on Theras's first evening away from home. Now it felt different. Then the younger group moved aside because the festival belonged to more people than themselves. Older choruses followed. Theras watched girls perform a song whose answering lines he had heard in rehearsal. Agesistrata stood among them, serious now, no longer the cousin who mocked his running. Their movements were precise. Theras noticed details he would have ignored before Gorgo's lessons. The spacing between dancers, the way one line responded to another, the pause held without anyone moving early. He understood how difficult stillness could be. When Agesistrata's chorus finished, she passed the younger boys. Theras expected some comment. She merely whispered, "You did not forget." Neither had she. The religious observances continued. Smoke rose from sacrifice, carrying the smell of burning fat and wood into the clear air. Portions would be distributed according to custom, while offerings honored the gods whose presence Spartans understood as woven into the life of their community. For Theras, religion had always been physical. Water poured over hands, garlands, smoke, songs, the careful handling of sacred objects, silence at particular moments, adults who behaved differently inside a sanctuary than they did in a courtyard. He had never needed someone to explain the difference between sacred and ordinary time. People showed him with their bodies. At one point, a procession formed. The boys walked together again, this time without dancing. They passed men from the citizen body, and families gathered near the route. Theras recognized craftsmen, helots attached to households, perioikoi who had come into Sparta for the occasion, and visitors from nearby settlements. The distinctions between them remained. A festival did not erase hierarchy, but it placed many of those lives within the same landscape of sound and ritual. Theras saw Eurotas near the edge of the gathering. Beside him stood Myrto. Theras smiled. Eurotas lifted one hand. Theras returned the greeting. Then, just behind them, he noticed a boy leaning slightly on a wooden staff. Menesarchos noticed, too. His step changed, only slightly. Theras followed his gaze. The boy was older than Menesarchos, perhaps 10 or 11. One leg turned differently as he stood. Beside him was a small table holding several clay objects. Horses, birds, a dog, small human figures, damas. Theras knew before anyone spoke. Menesarchos looked forward again. He kept the measure, but his face had changed. After the procession, the boys were allowed a period with their families before the communal activities continued. Menesarchos disappeared almost immediately. Theras found Lysandra first. Timoreta collided with him. "You were good." "Thank you." I could hear Antalkidas. Theras glanced toward his friend. Antalkidas was several paces away, eating something. "You could hear all of us." "No, I could hear him." Theras decided not to tell Antalkidas. Lysandra placed both hands briefly on Theras's shoulders. "You listened." He smiled. Agason stood nearby. "How was the turn?" Theras asked. "What turn?" "The second one. I watched the whole group." Theras felt slightly disappointed. Then he understood. His father had answered correctly. Agason had not watched Theras alone. That was the point. They ate a small portion of festival food together. The meat had been divided carefully. Bread accompanied it, along with onions and figs. Wine for adults was mixed with water, as Greek custom generally expected, while children drank water. Timareta objected to the onion. Theras immediately looked at Myrto. Myrto looked back. Neither needed to speak. After eating, Theras asked permission to find Menasarkos. He located him beside the table of clay figures. Damas was sitting now. The staff rested against his knee. Up close, Theras could see the resemblance between the brothers around the eyes. Menasarkos pointed toward him. "This is Theras." Damas examined him. "The knot thief." Theras stopped. Menasarkos laughed. "I told him. I did not steal it. You learned it without payment." Theras looked at the table. "Can I pay with one of your horses?" Damas stared at him. Then he laughed. Theras liked him immediately. The clay horse Menasarkos had once carried sat near Damas's hand. It looked even rougher beside the newer figures. Theras picked up a small bird. The wings had been marked with lines using a pointed tool before the clay hardened. "You made this?" "Yes." "For offerings?" "Some. Others people buy." Theras turned it carefully. Damas's hands were dusty with clay. His fingers were strong. "You taught Menasarkos the binding. He forgets half of what I teach him." "I do not," Menasarkos said. "You forgot how to repair the fishing net." "That was once." "Twice." Theras smiled. Damas shifted his leg. The movement seemed uncomfortable but practiced. "You boys used the knot?" "We repaired a roof." Damas nodded. "Good." There was no bitterness in the word, but Theras remembered Menasarkos saying that sometimes Damas liked his different life, and sometimes he did not. Theras looked at the clay figures. "Do you wish you were with us?" Menasarkos went still. Theras immediately wished he could pull the question back. Damas did not answer at once. Festival music sounded from farther away. Someone nearby laughed. A breeze moved through the leaves above them. "Sometimes," Damas said. Theras waited. "Sometimes I see you running and think I should be there." He picked up the clay horse. "Sometimes I see you running and am very pleased I am not." Menasarkos smiled. Damas continued. "The city had one path ready for me. My leg did not." He set the horse down. "That does not mean there was no other ground." Theras thought of the morning Doron had made them walk across stones. "Look where you place your feet, not only there." He understood the sentence differently now. A woman approached the table and examined one of Damas's small figures. Damas immediately turned toward her. "That one is a deer." "It looks like a goat." "It is a deer." She smiled. "How much?" Damas began bargaining. Menasarkos pulled Theras away before they interfered. They walked back toward the boys. "You asked him," Menasarkos said. "I should not have." "He does not mind." Theras looked back. "How do you know?" "He tells people when he minds." That sounded useful. The afternoon festival continued with competitions, songs, and communal gatherings. Theras watched older youths demonstrate exercises that seemed impossibly difficult. He watched men greet comrades from their common messes. He watched women move between family groups, organizing food and children with an efficiency that made official mail arrangements seem slow. Most of all, he watched people. Doron had told them to learn to see dependence. Theras was beginning to see something related. Sparta did not consist only of the citizens whose discipline would make its name famous. The citizen system stood at the center of power, certainly, supported by conquered labor and surrounded by free communities with fewer political privileges. But daily life spread far beyond the ideal image of the warrior. Someone shaped clay. Someone ground barley. Someone repaired roofs. Someone remembered songs. Someone trained choruses. Someone cultivated olives. Someone raised children who would enter different places in the same unequal world. Near evening, the younger boys assembled again. They were tired. Their fine garments had lost much of the morning's neatness. Echecratidas had a stain on one shoulder, and Talkidas had somehow acquired 2 figs, and refused to explain where the second had come from. Doron inspected them. "You performed well." 20 boys stood straighter. Then he added, "Tomorrow you return to work." Antalcidas sighed. Theras smiled. That sounded right. The festival had given him 1 day of music, family, sacred smoke, and public pride. But Sparta was not built from festival days alone. It was built in what happened afterward. When people folded the fine garments away, when the songs ended, when workers returned to fields, when boys woke before sunrise. As twilight settled over the valley, Theras walked back with his group. He no longer felt the nervous emptiness that had filled his stomach before the song. Instead, he carried a different memory. Damas sitting beside his clay animals. The city had prepared one path. His leg had not followed it. Still, he had found other ground. Theras looked at the boys walking around him. Their own paths seemed fixed from where they stood. But for the first time, he wondered how much could change before any of them became the men Sparta expected. The morning after the festival smelled of ashes. Theras noticed it as soon as he stepped outside. Sacred fires had gone cold during the night, but smoke still lingered faintly over parts of the settlement. Wilted greenery lay beside pathways. A broken garland had caught beneath a stone near the training ground, and someone had already begun carrying away the wooden benches used by older spectators. Yesterday, Sparta had sung. Today, it swept. Doron handed the boys baskets. Antalcidas looked inside his. Empty. "That is the idea," said Doron. Their first task was to collect what the festival had left behind. Theras smiled. There was something satisfying about it. He and Brasidas carried fallen branches from the gathering place. Cleon gathered discarded cord. Monasarchos carefully separated usable pieces from things that needed to be burned or thrown away. Echecratidas found half a barley cake beneath a bench. He examined it. Doron saw him. "No, I wasn't going to eat it. You were thinking about eating it." Echecratidas sighed and placed it in the wastebasket. Antalcidas whispered, "He knows your thoughts." "I know." The boys worked through the morning. By midday, the festival ground looked ordinary again. That transformation interested Theras. Public splendor depended upon private labor before and after it. Garlands did not weave themselves. Food did not arrive by prayer. Musicians practiced. Animals were tended. Fires were prepared. Vessels were washed. Floors were swept when everything ended. The city seemed most understandable when he looked at what happened around the important moments rather than only at the moments themselves. Several days later, another change came. It arrived not through ceremony but through weather. Clouds gathered above Taygetus. They had seen clouds before, of course, but these remained. The wind altered. The hot stillness of late summer weakened, and one afternoon the valley filled with the scent of damp earth before any rain had fallen. Theras was carrying practice equipment when the first drops struck the ground. Antalcidas looked upward. Rain. Theras held out one hand. A second drop landed on his palm, then another. Within moments, the boys were running beneath shelter as water swept across the training ground. Doron remained outside long enough to gather 2 shields left against a wall. His cloak darkened. Theras watched from beneath the roof. Rain changed Sparta quickly. Dust became mud. Roof edges began dripping. Water moved along shallow channels beside the lanes. The dry slopes above the valley darkened, and the Eurotas would rise as runoff came from the surrounding land. The boys expected training to stop. It did not. Doron entered carrying the wet shields. Inside. They followed him to a covered space. Phrynon waited there with wax tablets. Antalcidas groaned. "You preferred running?" "I have discovered that I did." Phrynon gave each boy a tablet and stylus. Theras sat. The wax surface was dark and smooth enough to receive marks while allowing mistakes to be erased by flattening it again. Phrynon scratched several letters. "Names," he said. They began with their own. Theras knew the letters, but forming them neatly was another matter. His first attempt leaned badly. Phrynon looked at it. "Has your name fallen down a hill?" Theras smoothed the wax. Again. Letters were useful throughout the Greek world for inscriptions, dedications, records, messages, ownership marks, and public business, though the degree of literacy varied widely. Sparta would never become famous for an abundance of written literature produced by its citizen elite. Its culture prized memory, concise speech, and oral transmission. Yet writing was not absent. Public officials needed records. Treaties and laws could be written. Sacred dedications bore names. Messages traveled. Households sometimes used written marks for practical purposes. Theras worked carefully. His second name stood straighter. Phrynon nodded. "Now your father's." Theras wrote Agason, then Lysandra, then Timareta. He paused afterward. Phrynon noticed. "Another?" Theras thought of Myrto. He wrote her name, then Eurotas. The tablet was becoming crowded. He added Menasarchos, then Damas. Antalcidas leaned over. "You are writing everyone in Sparta." Theras covered the tablet. "Write your own." "I have. It is excellent." Theras inspected it. One letter was backward. He said nothing. Rain drummed against the roof. They practiced until the light dimmed. When they emerged, the world smelled washed clean. Theras looked west. Cloud wrapped the upper slopes of Taygetus. Streams that had been nearly invisible in summer would begin carrying water. Farmers would watch the soil differently now. Autumn meant preparation, planting, repair, storage, and decisions that would shape food many months later. Sparta's warriors might become famous far beyond Laconia, but no shield made barley grow. The seasonal rhythm continued beneath every political ambition. A few mornings later, Doron took them into the fields again. This time there were no roof repairs. Workers were preparing ground. The boys watched oxen pull a plow through soil softened by rain. Theras had seen plowing since childhood, but now Doron required them to follow one furrow from beginning to end. The oxen moved slowly. Painfully slowly, Antalcidas thought. "You could walk faster," he said. The helot farmer guiding the plow glanced back. So could the ox. Antalcidas waited. The farmer pointed toward the furrow. But then, would it be straight? The boys followed. The wooden plow scratched and turned the soil rather than creating the deep furrows a much later farmer might expect from heavier equipment. Working Mediterranean land demanded close attention to soil, rainfall, slope, timing, and available animals. At the end, the farmer stopped the oxen. Doron asked, "Why does this matter to you?" "Food," Echecratidas answered immediately. Nobody laughed. He was correct. Doron nodded. "And what happens if the harvest is poor?" The boys knew enough to understand the first answer. Less food. What else? Silence. Doron looked toward the fields. Less contribution from households. Difficulty maintaining mess obligations. Difficulty supporting families. Difficulty supporting the system you are being trained to enter. Theras had never connected a furrow with citizenship. He did now. Full Spartiate status required more than birth and training. Adult citizens were expected to contribute to their common messes. Over time, families unable to maintain the economic requirements could lose full standing. The ideal citizen was supposed to devote himself to communal and military life. That ideal depended on land. Land depended on labor. Labor depended overwhelmingly on people who did not share the citizens' privileges. The structure was powerful. It was also vulnerable. Theras watched the plow turn. "How much land does father have?" Doron looked at him. "Ask your father." So Theras did. That evening, Agason was home. They sat in the courtyard while Lysandra checked a jar newly filled with oil. Theras asked the question. Aegeson did not answer with a number. Enough if it is managed well. Theras looked toward Lysandra. His mother laughed quietly. Which means I manage it. Aegeson accepted this. Theras sat beside him. Doran says a man can lose his place if his household cannot make the contribution. Yes? Has that happened? Yes. To people you know? Aegeson looked across the courtyard. Yes. Theras thought of Menesarchos and Damas. He had begun by imagining Spartan society as a set of permanent boxes. Citizen, helot, perioikos, boy, woman, king, craftsman. The longer he lived inside it, the more he noticed movement around the edges. Birth mattered enormously. Law mattered. Conquest mattered. But fortune mattered too. Land failed. Families shrank. Men lost status. Women inherited property. Accidents redirected lives. A person could stand firmly in one place and still discover that the ground beneath him was changing. Aegeson seemed to know where Theras' thoughts had gone. Do not mistake the rules of a city for the certainty of a city, he said. Theras looked at him. What does that mean? It means rules are made because life does not remain orderly by itself. Another long answer. Theras stored it away. Autumn deepened. The boys trained in cooler mornings. They ran farther. Their singing improved. The practice shields no longer seemed impossibly awkward. Theras grew strong enough to hold one without thinking constantly about his arm. One morning, Doran arranged them in a close line. Advance. They moved. The shields overlapped. Brasidas was beside Theras. Their steps matched. Stop. They stopped. Backward. Confusion. Echecratidas stepped on Cleon. Antalcidas turned sideways. The line opened. Doran sighed. Apparently, Sparta may conquer the world provided the world agrees to remain in front of you. The boys laughed. Again. They learned to move backward. Then sideways. Then to close a gap when Doran deliberately removed one boy. It was still a child's exercise, but Theras began to see the adult shape hidden inside it. Sparta's growing power would depend not simply upon individual courage but upon organized men, maintaining order in close formation. The hoplite line rewarded steadiness and mutual protection more than solitary heroics. Theras thought of all the lessons that had seemed unrelated. Walking together, dancing, carrying baskets, singing, listening, holding shields. Perhaps Doran had never been teaching separate things. One evening after training, Theras remained while the others settled. The autumn sky had cleared. Taygetus stood dark against the last light. Doran was collecting practice equipment. Theras helped without being asked. After several moments, he said, "Will Sparta always be like this?" Doran continued stacking shields. No. Theras had expected something more comforting. Why? Because nothing is. He placed the last shield against the wall. Cities grow. They become strong. They make enemies. They make allies. They remember some things and forget others. Theras looked toward the scattered lights of households. Is Sparta becoming stronger? Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Across Laconia and beyond, Spartan authority had already been shaped by generations of conquest, especially over the fertile lands and people of Messenia. Its citizen system increasingly centered life around military readiness, while neighboring communities and subject populations supported the structure beneath it. And beyond those mountains stood other Greek communities. Some would fear Sparta. Some would seek its help. Some would challenge it. Theras had spent months learning how one boy found his place among 20. He was beginning to realize that Sparta itself was doing something similar among the cities of Greece. Doran turned toward the sleeping quarters. Come. Theras followed. Behind him, the practice shields rested in a neat row. Ahead lay another morning. And beyond that, though he could not yet see it, waited the years in which the lessons of childhood would stop being practice. The news crossed Taygetus on a gray afternoon. Theras was carrying 2 practice shields back beneath the shelter when he saw the travelers entering Sparta. At first, there was nothing unusual about them. 4 men, 2 pack animals. Mud dried along the hems of their cloaks. 1 man walked with a slight limp. Then Theras recognized his father's red wool cloak. He almost dropped the shields. Agison looked older than when he had left. Not greatly older, only tired. His beard had grown rough, his sandals were stained from the mountain roads, and one edge of the red cloak had been repaired with thread of a slightly different color. But he was home. Theras set the shields down carefully. Doron had taught him too well to abandon equipment in the dirt, even for his father. Then he ran. Agison saw him coming. He put down the bundle he was carrying. Theras stopped 1 pace away, suddenly unsure whether a boy in the Agog was still permitted to throw himself against his father like Timareta did. Agison solved the problem. He pulled Theras against him. The embrace lasted only a few breaths. Yet Theras felt the mountain cold still caught in his father's cloak. "You crossed it," he said. Agison looked toward Taygetus, and crossed back. "Was there snow?" "Higher up." "Did you see Messenia?" "Yes." "Did you see—" Agison raised 1 hand. Theras stopped. "You have discovered questions. Phrynon encourages them." "That sounds dangerous." Theras smiled. They walked toward home. Lysandra was already waiting at the courtyard entrance. Timareta ignored every idea of Spartan restraint and launched herself at Agison. He lifted her. "You are heavier. You are dirtier." Both statements were true. Myrto brought water. Eurotas appeared from the rear of the property and greeted Agison with a quiet nod. For an instant, Theras watched the 2 men carefully. Agison, the citizen returning from conquered Messenia. Eurotas, the helot whose labor helped support that citizenship. Nothing dramatic passed between them. "Good journey?" Eurotas asked. "Long?" "Mountain road?" "Wet." Eurotas smiled faintly. "Then Taygetus remains Taygetus." Agison washed before eating. Lysandra had prepared barley bread, cheese, olives, greens, and a small portion of meat. Timareta insisted on sitting beside her father and asked questions without waiting for answers. Were there wolves? No. Bandits? No. Giants? No. Did you bring me anything? Agison reached into his travel bundle. He produced a small smooth stone. Timareta stared. "A stone?" From the other side of Taygetus. She took it. Her disappointment vanished. Theras understood. Distance could make an ordinary object precious. Later, when Timareta had gone to show the stone to Myrto, Theras sat with Agison beneath the courtyard shelter. Rain had begun lightly. Drops struck the roof tiles above them. What was Messenia like? Agison considered. Green after the rain, broader in places than this valley, good land. Better than ours. For some crops. Theras waited. And the people? Agison looked at him. There are many people. You know what I mean. Yes. Agison rested his forearms on his knees. Theras had rarely seen him searching for words. That alone made the answer feel important. I saw men working land their grandfathers did not choose to work for Spartan masters. Theras remained still. Did they hate you? Some probably did. Did they say so? No. Why not? Agison gave him a long look. You know why. Theras did. Power could create silence without creating agreement. Outside the courtyard, rainwater trickled through a channel. Agison continued. Sparta remembers the conquest as victory. The people who lost remember it differently. Theras thought of Phrynon. People remembered pictures. A goat in a tree could survive longer than 10 lost baskets. What pictures did Messenian families remember? He did not know. Will they always be helots? Agison looked toward the darkening courtyard. I cannot tell you what always means. It was another answer Theras might once have found unsatisfying. Now he accepted it. Doron had said cities changed. Phrynon had warned them about certainty. His father had said rules existed because life would not remain orderly by itself. Theras was beginning to hear these lessons joining together. The next morning, Agison left for his common mess before Theras reported to training. Their household had hardly recovered from his arrival before civic obligations reclaimed him. Theras no longer found this strange. He understood that his father belonged simultaneously to several circles: household, mess group, citizen body, military organization, kin, religious community. Sparta trained men to belong widely, even while outsiders later imagined them only as soldiers. At the training ground, Doron noticed Theras' distraction. "Your father returned." "Yes." "And brought your attention back with him?" Theras straightened. "Yes." "Good. Use it." That morning, the boys trained with shields. The practice line had changed enormously since the first awkward days. They no longer stared down. They no longer bumped every few steps. Doron arranged them, then began altering the formation. Brasidas out. Brasidas stepped away. Theras shifted. Close. The gap vanished. Minosarkos back. Another adjustment. Turn. They turned. Stop. 20 boys halted almost together. Almost. Antalcidas needed half a step. Doron looked at him. Antalcidas quietly returned his foot. Again. The boys advanced. Theras felt the wooden shield against his arm. He remembered holding Agason's spear months earlier and thinking primarily about weight. Now he understood something else. Equipment was only useful inside skill. Skill was only useful inside attention. Attention was only useful if a man could preserve it when tired, frightened, hungry, angry, or uncertain. They were still children. No one pretended otherwise. But the habits forming now were intended to remain when childhood did not. After practice, Doron did something unexpected. He dismissed the others but asked Theras to stay. Antalcidas looked over his shoulder with great sympathy. Theras ignored him. Doron sat beneath an olive tree. "Your father told me you asked about Messenia." Theras was surprised. "You spoke with him?" "Sparta is not large enough for your family to remain secret." Theras sat nearby. Doron picked up a fallen olive leaf. "You have become troubled by the people beneath our system." Theras did not know whether troubled was the right word. He thought of Eurotas, Myrto, the farmers, the plow, the storage roof, Agison crossing conquered land. "Yes." Doron turned the leaf between his fingers. "Good." Theras looked at him. He had expected correction. Doron continued. "A citizen who never examines the cost of his comfort becomes stupid. A citizen who believes noticing the cost makes him free of it becomes vain." Theras frowned. What should he do? "Know what is true." "That is all?" "No." Doron dropped the leaf. "But it is where useful decisions begin." Theras wanted a clearer rule. Doron did not give one. Perhaps there was none. That afternoon, Phrynon gathered the boys for recitation. Instead of giving them familiar verses, he asked each to speak briefly about something he had learned during the past year. No speeches. One thought. Brasidas went first. "Speed is not useful if it breaks the line." Doron, standing nearby, gave no sign, but Theras knew he approved. Echecratidas said, "Food is work before it is food." Antalcidas whispered, "Profound." Echecratidas ignored him. Cleon spoke about memory. Minosarkos said, "Someone who is not here can still teach you." Theras looked at him. Damas. Phrynon nodded. Then Antalcidas's turn came. He thought unusually long. Finally he said, "Being uncomfortable does not mean something is wrong." The boys became quiet. It was so sensible that Theras almost suspected someone else had said it. Antalcidas looked offended by their surprise. Then Phrynon turned to Theras. Theras had too many answers. "A shield is not only yours. Listen before deciding you understand. The sparks are not the work. People remember pictures. Rules are not certainty." He thought of Eurotas, Damas, Agassiz, Lysandra counting jars. 20 boys dancing beneath festival sunlight. At last he said, "Look at what holds something up." Phrynon studied him. "What do you mean?" Theras hesitated. He had been told to keep answers short, but sometimes a thought required one more sentence. "A shield line, a roof, a household, a city. They all stand because something carries the weight." Phrynon smiled. "That will do." Winter slowly loosened. Almond blossoms appeared in sheltered places. The afternoons grew longer. Water still ran cold, but the air changed. Theras had nearly completed a full turning of the seasons since entering the communal education. The boy who had arrived carrying his father's red cloak had not vanished. He still loved honey, still disliked losing at wrestling, still laughed when Aunt Taygetus said something foolish, still missed home some nights. But his world had widened. One evening, Lysandra called him to the storeroom. She was holding the wax tablet on which household quantities were recorded. "Oil," she said. Theras looked at the jars. "How much?" "Enough, if managed well." She laughed. "You sound like your father." Together they counted. Theras understood more than the last time. Consumption, storage, contributions, work still required before the next harvest. Nothing was merely a jar anymore. When they finished, Agassiz entered. He had the red cloak folded over one arm. Theras recognized it immediately. The same cloak he had carried on his first morning. Agassiz held it out. "Take this to the sleeping quarters." Theras blinked. "Why?" "The nights are still cold. My cloak is enough." "I know." Theras accepted the heavier wool. The fabric rested across his arms. For a moment, the first morning returned so clearly that he could almost hear the distant trumpet and Timareta asking whether she could have his bed. He looked at Agassiz. "I kept it off the ground." His father remembered. A small smile appeared. "Yes." Theras carried the cloak through Sparta as evening settled. This time it did not feel like his father's world being handed to him. It felt like an object that had traveled between them. At the sleeping quarters he folded it carefully beside his reeds. Menasarchos noticed the red wool. "Your father's?" Theras nodded. Aunt Taygetus reached toward it. Theras moved it away. "Do not." "I was only looking." "You look with your hands." "That is how I see best." Theras laughed. The boys settled. Before the lamps were extinguished, Agassiz entered. "You have a long walk tomorrow." "Where?" Brasidas asked. "Toward Amyclae." The name was familiar. South of Sparta lay Amyclae, an older settlement absorbed into the Spartan state and home to the important sanctuary of Apollo at Amyclae. The route was not distant enough to be an expedition, but far enough to make the younger boys attentive. "Why?" Aunt Taygetus asked. Agassiz smiled faintly. "To see whether a year of training has taught you how to walk." Aunt Taygetus lay back. "We began with walking." "Yes." "So, after everything we are walking again." "Yes." Theras pulled Agissiz's red cloak over himself. Warmth settled around his shoulders. He understood something Aunt Taygetus did not. They were not returning to the first lesson because nothing had changed. They were returning because everything had. Tomorrow they would walk again over Laconian ground. But not as the children who had once crossed a dusty field while Doron corrected every step. And beyond that walk waited one final lesson before Theras's first year closed. One that would not ask how firmly a Spartan could stand, but what, after learning to stand, he believed was worth standing for. They left for Amyclae while the valley was still blue with morning shadow. Theras carried no practice shield. Neither did the others. Each boy had a cloak, a little food, and a water vessel. Doron walked at the front while Agassiz followed behind, and Phrynon accompanied them for the first part of the journey with a staff in one hand. The road south was familiar in pieces. Theras had traveled portions of it with his family, but never like this. Today, nobody told the boys where to place their feet. Nobody reminded Brasidas to slow down. Nobody warned Taygetus to save his breath. They simply walked. Theras noticed the change after the first mile. The line was not perfect, nor was it meant to be, yet the boys adjusted naturally around one another. When the path narrowed, they closed. When stones made the ground difficult, they gave one another room. When Echecratidas stopped briefly to tighten a sandal fastening, the nearest boys slowed without instruction. Doron looked back once. He said nothing. Theras smiled. A year earlier, silence from Doron had usually made him nervous. Now it could be praise. Morning spread across Laconia. Mist lay low beside parts of the Eurotas. Farther away, cultivated plots showed the fresh green of the season. Men worked among vines. Sheep bells sounded from higher ground. Behind them stood Sparta, scattered through the valley without the enclosing walls that visitors expected from powerful cities. Ahead lay Amyclae. Long before Sparta had dominated the surrounding region, Amyclae had possessed its own identity. Over generations it became part of the Spartan state, and its sanctuary of Apollo remained an important religious center. The boys were going there not to witness a great festival, but to see a place where memory reached farther back than their own city's present confidence. Phrynon stopped near a roadside stone. My knee has decided that wisdom should return to Sparta. Taygetus looked at him. Will wisdom reach it? If Doron walks slowly. Doron did not appear amused. Phrynon turned to the boys. Remember something for me. They waited. A city becomes foolish when it thinks everything important began with itself. Then he turned back toward Sparta. Theras watched him go. The sentence seemed designed for the road ahead. By late morning, they reached the sanctuary area. Theras had seen sacred spaces before, yet this one felt different. Apollo was worshipped here in forms shaped by long layers of tradition. The famous monumental arrangements later associated with the sanctuary would change across time, but Amyclae already carried the weight of old cult and local memory. People had prayed here before Theras's grandfather was born, before Aegison's grandfather, before anyone alive could remember. Doron led the boys quietly through the precinct. They saw offerings, stone, worked bronze, places darkened by smoke, objects placed by people whose names had disappeared while their gestures remained. Theras thought of Damas's clay deer, or goats. Perhaps it did not matter what strangers called them after the maker was gone. Someone had shaped them. Someone had carried them. Someone had believed the offering mattered. Near the sanctuary, Doron sat beneath a tree. The boys gathered around him. He did not begin with Apollo. Instead he asked, "What is Sparta?" Taygetus looked suspicious. Theras understood why. Questions from Doron often contained traps. Brasidas answered first. "Our city." "What makes it our city?" "The citizens." Doron waited. Brasidas reconsidered. "The people." "All of them." Nobody answered. Theras thought of Myrto grinding barley, Eurotas beside the irrigation channel, Theocles striking heated iron, Gorgo counting steps, Phrynon holding his lyre, Agesistrata running, Damas shaping clay, Lysandra counting oil jars, his father crossing Taygetus, the boys beside him. "Not everyone belongs to it in the same way," Theras said. Doron looked at him. "No." Theras continued carefully. "But they are all part of what makes it." Doron nodded. "What else?" Menasarchos looked toward the sanctuary. "People who came before." "Yes." Echecratidas said, "Land." "Yes." Cleon added, "Laws." Doron nodded again. Taygetus thought longest. Then he said, "Things people agree to keep doing." Doron looked almost pleased. "Such as?" "Training." "Songs," said Menasarchos. "Festivals." "The messes." "Sacrifices." "Helping close a line," Brasidas added. Doron let them speak. Theras realized that none of them had answered incorrectly. Sparta was not one thing. Perhaps that was the final lesson. They had spent a year being taught to simplify action. Tie the knot, keep the measure, watch the ground. Listen, stand close. But the city those actions served could not be simplified so easily. It contained courage and fear, discipline and privilege, memory and invention. Citizenship supported by people denied citizenship. Women who managed property without standing in the citizens' assembly. Craftsmen who made the weapons of men forbidden by custom from becoming craftsmen. Kings whose power was limited. Helots whose enforced labor made citizen leisure possible. Boys taught loyalty while slowly discovering the contradictions hidden inside what they were asked to love. Doron picked up a small stone. Theras remembered another pebble thrown into the Eurotas months earlier. What should a Spartan protect? Doron asked. The boys were silent. Theras expected someone to say Sparta. Nobody did. Perhaps the answer had become too easy. Doron turned the stone in his hand. At last, Menisarchos said, "The people beside him." Brasidas added, "His household." Cleon said, "The laws." Doron looked toward Theras. Theras thought of Agason's shield. A shield is not only yours, then of the Messenian workers his father had seen. A city remembers victory differently from those who lost. Then of Damas. The city had prepared one path. His leg had found another ground. Theras understood that he could not solve Sparta at 7 years old, nor at 8, perhaps not even as an old man. He could only decide what kind of attention he would bring to the life given to him. "The things that deserve to keep standing," he said. Doron watched him. "And how will you know what deserves that?" Theras looked down at his hands. "I suppose I have to keep looking." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Doron smiled. It was not a large smile. Theras had never seen him give one. "Good." They ate near the sanctuary. Barley bread, cheese, figs, a few olives. Echecratidas received the last fig. He looked at it, then broke it in two and gave half to Antalcidas. Antalcidas stared. "What happened to you?" "A year of suffering. You have become generous." "I may recover." The boys laughed. Afterward, they began walking home. The afternoon was warm. Their shadows moved beside them along the road. Theras grew tired, but not unhappily. Sparta appeared gradually. First the wider valley, then smoke from houses, then familiar paths, then the loose collection of settlements that formed the city. Near the fields, they passed Eurotas. He was carrying a tool over one shoulder. Theras raised his hand. "Eurotas?" Eurotas smiled. "Still have both feet?" Theras looked down. "Dusty. Sore. Still there." "Yes." "Then Doron has failed to ruin you." Doron, several paces ahead, called without turning. "I heard that." Eurotas laughed. Theras continued. Near the training ground, families had gathered, not for ceremony, simply because the boys were returning at the end of their first year. Timareta stood in front. Of course she did. She ran toward Theras. "You came back." "I always come back." "You said that last time." "It was true last time." Lysandra approached more slowly. She touched his cheek. "You are thin." Theras laughed. "No, I am not. All mothers say it, especially when it is not true." She smiled. He had remembered. Agason stood behind her wearing the red cloak. Theras looked at it, then at the cloak folded over his own arm. He had carried it back from the sleeping quarters that morning. He held it out. Agason took it. For an instant, they were exactly where they had been 1 year earlier. Father receiving red wool from son, mother beside them, Sparta waking and changing around their household. "You kept it off the ground," Agason said. Theras smiled. "Yes." Timareta tugged his tunic. "Can I have your bed now?" He looked at her. "No. You do not even sleep there every night anymore." "No." She sighed with theatrical disappointment. Myrto was waiting in the courtyard when they returned. The quern stood beside her. Theras heard its familiar scraping before he entered. Around, again, around. The sound had not changed, yet he had. He helped her for a while without asking. His arms were stronger now. The stone still required work. "That is enough," Myrto said eventually. Theras released the handle. "Eurotas says you greeted him." "I always do now." "Good." Evening gathered. Agassiz went to his common mess. Lysandra checked household stores. Timaretta placed her stone from Messenia beside her wooden doll. Myrto finished the barley. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, boys were singing. Theras recognized the melody. He sat beneath the doorway and listened. Tomorrow, training would continue. The agogo would grow harder as he grew older. The years ahead would demand more endurance, sharper discipline, greater responsibility, and eventually the full obligations expected of a Spartan citizen. Sparta itself would continue rising. Its armies would become feared. Its institutions would fascinate other Greeks. Its name would travel farther than Theras ever imagined. Later generations would simplify it. They would remember red cloaks, shields, short answers, severe training, and men standing in close formation. Those things were real, but they were not the whole city. The whole city was harder to carry. It included the hand on the plow, the woman measuring oil, the craftsman waiting for metal to reach the correct heat, the boy shaping a clay horse, the old man teaching a song, the conquered worker whose grain fed the citizen, the child learning that a shield protected another man as well as himself. Theras sat quietly while darkness settled over the Eurotas valley. Taygetus stood against the western sky. For most of his childhood, the mountains had seemed permanent. Doran had taught him otherwise. Nothing was. Not cities. Not laws. Not power. Not even the stories people told about themselves. What could endure, perhaps, was the habit of paying attention. Listen before deciding you understand. Look at what carries the weight. Remember the person beside you. Theras heard Timaretta calling him to eat. He stood. Before entering the courtyard, he looked once toward the darkening lanes of Sparta. Then he went inside.